We know that most students and professors in town are in exams, and we know that everybody with hair like me are on Bornholm for the Folkemøde, but we are live streaming the event, and we will have participants from not just Denmark, but hopefully a lot of African scholars joining us online. We have a technicality issue, I should say. First of all, I should of course say welcome to those who are here, welcome to those who are following us. My name is not Hans Lucht. Hans Lucht called in sick this morning. He is currently coordinating our migration unit. I used to do it before, so I have no problem welcoming you on part of our migration research unit at DIIS. As we live stream, it will be important that if you as an audience ask questions, that you use a microphone and say your name. The live stream can only see who is up here. And if you don't want to be public, then maybe you should know that whatever you say will be recorded, right? And we usually put our live stream events up on our channel so that you can also watch it afterwards. Then we have a technical problem today, for which I apologize, but if any of you people out there in the world would like to comment or ask questions to the three presentations this morning, you need to do it via email. So the way to do it is to write me an email. My mail address is nns, the email sign, DIIS.dk. I repeat, NNS, arroba, what is that called in English? At DIIS.dk. And put please in the message area ABM so that I can sort if there are any comments or questions to this event. Apart from that, I hope we'll have a fruitful morning, and I will leave the word to the main organizer, Natalia Ribas. So please take the stage.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. Thank you for attending this morning together. We are very delighted to see all of you here. I'm talking on behalf of myself, of course. My name is Natalia Ribas-Mateos from Transmena Group in Autónoma of Barcelona. But also, you know, I would be talking on behalf of the other two authors, because we are preparing these edited volumes. We'll talk about this in a minute. So I also want to, to welcome you on behalf of Papa So from Nordic Institute in Uppsala, and also on behalf of Henri Yambene from the Ministry of Education in Yaoundé. So thank you so much. And hello. So you can say. You can talk directly, Henri. This is a good news that you are around. Volume, micro. Micro.
No, he has to do it.
Yeah, I'm telling him. Micro.
Okay. Yes, good morning, all of you. Good morning to all of you.
Good
morning. Are you not getting me?
Yes, Natalia, let him know that we are sure.
Yeah, okay, everything okay.
Yes, okay, good morning. I've said good morning to all of you.
Yeah, good morning. Just say a longer hello. We are listening to you. No problem. Thank you.
Okay. So I can shut my microphone.
Okay. Thank you very much, Henri. Thanks to say hello to us here in Copenhagen. And just before we start the session, I will tell you what's this whole story about, because it's a very big project. We're like, I think, around 56 people that we have to coordinate all over the world with different times and everything. It's a bit complex and little resources also, so both things come together. But just to tell you quickly what it is, we are preparing, a 2-volume book on African borders in motion. So that's the objective, with a Palgrave Macmillan, and we'll do it for the month of November or something. We want to have everything ready for that time, so it's a very quick, publications. But the meaning of these seminars to us is like to work in a collective form as much as we can, with all the limitations that we are aware of. So to build something together, concerning these African borders in motions. And for that, we've organized already a seminar in Saint-Louis, Senegal, simultaneously, which was a bit complicated, to tell you the truth, the simultaneity, with Casablanca, Morocco. We're just back from 10 days ago from Casablanca. In my case, I was in Casablanca. The Henri and Papa, they were in Saint-Louis that moment. And now, so then the next one is this one. The third one is this one. And the fourth one is next week in Uppsala. And the fifth one is the last one in Lisbon in September. So you're all welcome to follow and fit up the whole sessions, whatever. Just you're all welcome to join us in any way. Nothing, just me. I'm not from Scandinavia. I'm from Spain, but the objective of this tandem, which is Copenhagen, Uppsala, would be to work on these issues from this kind of Scandinavian networks, if possible. So that was the objective. So it's like what Ninna said on the heading of the program. To connect. Africa, which is especially, to tell you the truth, West Africa, that's the main connections are like this now. West Africa, North Africa, Southern Europe. There's no seminar in Southern Europe just because there's a few Southern Europeans among us, but this is not related to Southern Europe very much, only something about the Canary Islands that is going to be held tomorrow. But that's Africa also, Canary Islands. So, and then so it's to find this connection, this triangle here, Africa, especially Africa, Scandinavia production, and a little bit, of people who are coming from Southern Europe, like Agnese today and myself. That's all. I don't want to talk longer because I could be talking for hours also. But I just want to thank you, and I thank all of you, and thanks to Ninna, of course, and Sophie, and Agnese, and Emily, and all the people that have made this possible. And also, I want to thank DIIS in general, because this opportunity for me, it connects, with this seminar also, because I was stay here last year for 2 months, with Ninna, with Hans, and with Sophie and all this group, and that was, the seeds of this project come from here, because the book proposal was written here at DIIS last summer. Thank you very much.
we try again? Better? Better. So I will give a short presentation of a project I finalized on governing climate mobility in Africa. And in Africa we studied 2 countries, Ghana and Ethiopia, but I will only speak about Ethiopia. And we will start in the Labor and Skills Office in Shashamane, which is in southern Ethiopia town, where the head office gave me an update on migration as it exists in the region. This office is tasked with job creation, but increasingly also with preventing illegal migration and human trafficking. It launches information campaigns about the risks involved in irregular migration and provides prospective migrants with the skills that presumably will enable migration through legal means. The latter understood to be through bilateral state agreements. To my question about challenges in that regard, the officer shrugs. We have discussions with returnees, most of whom are women who have come back because they were deported or because they were suffering abuse from their employers. They went without papers. No matter what the reason, most plan to go again. Government measures against irregular recruitment agencies, which is done primarily by cancelling licenses, seem not to work very well. New agencies simply take over as soon as some is closed down. The office talks about illegal migration as something that puts people's lives at risk. But then I asked, so what can you do about it? And they tell about a project where the Coca-Cola company has donated 40 shades, like party pavilloner. Each shade will be hosting 5 women who can sell soft drinks at the roadside. There are already at least 100 other people out there doing that. So that's the kind of support that they will give from the state office, and all the money, the funds going into it comes from donors. So the only money these state officials have in that office is if they apply to NGOs and get people there. So the day I'm there, they say for the last month 200 people registered, but we could only provide shades for 10. Representatives of parallel institutions in northern Ethiopia are also frustrated, given that North and South Wollo, where we also carried out research, are the main sending areas for migrants destined for the Gulf and the Middle East. It's a matter of concern that no specific government program is targeting returned migrants there. And when I say returned, most are deported. Some return on their own, because their contract ends, but I use this term returned sort of to emphasize that it's not necessarily the will of the women. Anyway, in North Wollo there's also no support, and there the officials also agree that most will probably leave as soon as a new opportunity gets to them. So even though they came back deported, they will go again. So such accounts of the current migration situation among Ethiopian women, I think, are striking in several ways. I mean, one cannot ignore the deeply felt desire for people working in these offices to do something, to help out, nor their frustration that they actually have very little means to do so. But it's equally hard to miss how the language of stricter migration management, including to prevent irregular migration, sort of spills into ways this is spoken about. It is a difficult task to stop human smugglers and traffickers, they say, when women are only waiting to leave. However, as women are presumed to be more vulnerable to human trafficking than men, protecting them from international migration is apparently for their own good. Because danger lurks outside the walls of the home and the national space. Trafficking, abuse, and exploitation are very common concerns in the discussions of Ethiopian migrant domestic workers, and the risks involved in traveling irregularly are well documented. There's a lot of studies doing this. So also well documented are the poor living and working conditions that domestic workers encounter in the Middle East, including long working hours, physical and sexual abuse, and even assault. The withholding of passports, the refusal to pay the salaries, these stories. In the first case, attention has centered on the deceitful recruiters, unscrupulous human smugglers, and violent human traffickers, who are believed to form part of international criminal networks. The combined effects of economic hardship, protracted conflict, and climate change hazards, they say, sort of increases the risk that people will use these means. While I think these are, again, legitimate concerns, deeper considerations of why and how Ethiopians choose to migrate is lacking. Nobody talks about that. Is it possible, I ask, that women consider their chances for improvement in their relative well-being to be higher through migration than through locally available pathways? Could it be that they are aware that successful migration takes very hard work, perseverance, and the endurance of a degree of hardship, which they hope will be of a temporary nature? In the absence of decent local jobs and adequate social protection, migration often becomes the only viable means of mitigating risk. Focusing solely on the risks associated with irregular border crossing and potentially exploitative working conditions, I think readily overlooks why women leave and what are the dangers of being a woman in Ethiopian society. My presentation today then explores the structural and social circumstances that prompt Ethiopian women to engage in this variety of mobility practices. And as I said, it builds on a collective project, and I should mention that the data that I use was collected not just by me, but by very good colleagues, Professor Serihun Mohammed and Professor Deselin Ramato, both from Addis Ababa University, and an Ethiopian PhD student called Abera Aglali, and several research assistants also participated in this young skilled students from Addis Ababa University. So I'm very grateful for this collective effort, but I am solely responsible for the analysis today, and not all my colleagues would perhaps agree with me on the analysis. As will be apparent, women's migration in Ethiopia is, like, generalized, almost only talked about as human trafficking. And so it's become a generic term, even though it's well-established paths to go to the Middle East to work as domestic workers. Sort of the official discourse about it is that these women are trafficked. And I will say, well, it's not necessarily so. I mean, some are for sure, but there's a lot of things going on. So to avoid predetermining a multitude of experiences as necessarily human trafficking, I introduce the concept of trespassing. Albert Hirschman conceived of the idea of conceptual trespassing in the field of development studies as an analytical means of questioning conventional stances and understanding new dynamics. He did so in 81, 2, 3, a long time ago. But recently, more recently, two Italian scholars, Pucci and Vecchio, have suggested trespassing as a relevant conceptual, analytical, and operational approach to mobility studies. I would say that most people associate trespassing with an unauthorized entry on someone else's property. That meaning is also part of the Merriam-Webster dictionary, if you look it up, where the noun trespass is exactly to do an illegal entry, right? The other part is a violation of moral and social ethics, which I find interesting. Used as a verb, as in to commit a trespass, the dictionary likewise suggests a dual definition, either to enter unlawfully upon the land of another or to violate the bounds of good behavior. Both meanings prove very useful for the analysis that I will make, because I will argue that Ethiopian migrant women cross various boundaries, including both state borders and gendered norms for proper behavior when they leave to seek their fortune elsewhere. That trespassing makes them vulnerable to exploitation and human trafficking, but it also enables a tricking of migration control, very effectively actually, or of overcoming other obstacles surrounding their mobility as human beings in an Ethiopian context. I therefore suggest using trespasses as an analytical device in the discussion of African borders in motion. The experience of Ethiopian migrant domestic workers in the Middle East have, as I said, received significant attention. What happens on the routes, what happens in the workplaces, the conditions they face upon their arrival, what happens when they get deported. So we know that. But I should maybe also say that, I mean, the route to the Middle East of just one of several, but it's the route that women take, because many other people go to South Africa, many other Ethiopian, especially young men, go to South Africa. There's a well-established Ethiopian community there. And of course, if the intention is to get to Europe, you go to Khartoum, Libya. Well, you did at least until the recent war. But given that the women I talk about, most of them 65, 70, we don't know, but many, the majority, they travel undocumented. We don't really know how many they are. But I was in the the United Arab Emirates in December, and the Ethiopian embassy there, they say that, well, here we believe 200,000, Saudi Arabia we believe 800,000, but then there are all the other countries where Lebanon used to be a great destination. So I think it's fair to say that we are talking maybe about 1.5 million women, of which 65% or more are irregular. And you know, they in the Middle East, there's this work system called kafala, where you have sort of special contracts, and in the paper I have a long discussion of that I will skip. I have also a long part discussing human trafficking and the international conventions, how human trafficking is defined, where I show that what's going on actually is not according to international conventions exactly that, because a lot of this migration is organized through family networks or through small-scale human smugglers, often former migrants who help out with giving a little help. That is not to say that it doesn't go wrong. Sometimes it goes terribly wrong, but it's not this criminal international networks that we hear about. The Ethiopian state, on the other hand, do these bilateral contracts, and they have just signed a big deal with Saudi Arabia, which is known to be maybe among the worst places, to send 500,000. I mean, there's been a war, the government needs money, remittances sent by these women are very important. So, you know, we usually criticize the states women go to for not living up to labor standards whatsoever, but I would say that we need also, of course, to take sending states into account if they allow such things to happen. Of course, the deals are set to be made to protect, but if there are no institutions really, I mean, how do you go in and control in private homes that rules are followed? So it's a very contested area. Human trafficking is, as I said, very much reported, very much spoken about, and many say that it's underreported. It's underreported. I would say maybe it's overreported, because when you look at the studies done on human trafficking in Ethiopia and how they have sampled the women they talked to, they have went to shelters where women are held after they come back if they are believed to be trafficked. So of course they would say, I'm trafficked, because that's what gives them access to shelter, to some social provisions, maybe some money. So I mean, there might be an over-reporting issue there. I have also worked in the shelters, and I know that many women there are actually victims of human traffic or survivors and in bad shape. But the great majority of these women traveling back and forth never come near these shelters. But that's anyway where most international researchers who do research on this issue go to do their interviews, because, I mean, it's a nice place to do interviews in. I have 15 minutes max. I should say that we should perhaps understand this migration of Ethiopian women in a much broader sense than just sort of being lured by traffickers going to the Middle East, and say, I mean, what are the economic, political, social, cultural conditions for women in Ethiopia? Because maybe, I mean, going even to harsh working condition is a reasonable capability enhancing choice. This term is coined by Carolyn Shevel, who has done great research on Ethiopian migrants. And she shows that migration often arises at a particular moment in women's lives, either very young women who might migrate actually either to escape an early arranged marriage, often organized through sister networks, or after a husband dies, or a husband takes a second wife who's not nice, or after divorce. So there are some social events that sort of triggers the moment that people go. We could also see when interviewing women, both within returned women in Ethiopia and the women we talked to in the United Arab Emirates, that I mean, they go way beyond financial considerations. I mean, they go to escape something. I mean, conflict in many parts of Ethiopia, violence, domestic violence of different kinds, street violence, even sort of religious clashes. So there are many reasons, and violence, gender-based violence, and violence against women in particular, is extremely widespread in Ethiopia. You can look up on any sort of international statistics and you will find that the score is very high. But again, the trafficking discourse leaves very little room for sort of even talking about these other reasons, because human trafficking is bad. There are international resources for that. I mean, African states also have to live up to showing that they do a lot to prevent it, because the United States of America, that do the TIP report, the Trafficking in Persons report, yearly, they sanction countries unless they can show that they actually actively do something in this field. Not all is that black and white, and I have a lot of ethnographic examples in the larger paper, but I will give you an example here of Rahima, who returned to Shashamene, which is in the south of Ethiopia, from Kuwait in 2020. And that was incidentally 3 weeks before anyone had ever heard of COVID-19. So we asked, why did you come back? She said, I was exhausted. Her migration experience included 2 years in Dubai. She said, no good, no much money. Small money, she said. Then I returned to Ethiopia, remigration to Kuwait for 3 years, another return to Ethiopia, and finally 2 more years in Kuwait until her recent return, which she considers final. Prior to migration, she sustained a living as a market vendor, but struggled to feed her 2 children after her first husband died. And her second husband turned out to be a bad one who didn't contribute financially. So she decided to go abroad, or she had to do something to support her 2 children. And her travel arrangements for Dubai were made through official channels. I mean, so she went on one of these state contracts. And remember, she said, you know, the money was small. But when she went to Kuwait on her own, she could negotiate the salary and got considerable more out of that. And instead of living only in one home and being a live-in domestic, she worked there by the hour, sort of cleaning in different homes, so she could make money. And she actually considered irregularity a better option. Illegal agencies in Kuwait offer jobs to women without passports, she said. It's better to be without, the salary is higher. Thus, trespassing legal boundaries meant better earnings. Despite the hardships, Rahima emphasizes that migration enabled her to provide her children with a better education. However, she also acknowledges a lack of control over the substantial sums remitted to her family, which were intended to buy a plot of land and build a house for her and her children. But she found an empty plot and a lot of money unwisely spent when she returned the first time. So, I mean, that was not due to human trafficking, but due to, again, not respecting a woman's efforts in her patriarchal family. Yeah. A peak of human trafficking as something to be wary of. I spoke, for instance, to 3 young workers in an industrial free trade zone, which is what donors like Denmark support to create jobs locally to prevent women from embarking on risky journeys, where they will earn, I would say, 1/4 of what they can earn by migrating to the Middle East. Sort of less than $50 a month is the salary level in these parks, and $250 if you're lucky, a bit more, by going to the Middle East. But anyway, I talked to 3 workers there who said, we've heard a lot of bad stories, so that's why we would never consider going to the Middle East. We talked to village elders, we talked to local authorities, and they also spoke about the risks involved. But they also underscored the unlawfulness of traveling without permission. And I say permission because it was not just papers, but also father's permission, or we in the community don't like it. So I mean a gendered moral permission. The return migrants we talked to had mainly used irregular channels, some in combination with regular travel arrangements, entering on a tourist visa, then overstaying. So the general picture was actually one of moving in and out of irregularity, and something that the women, to some extent, I wouldn't say mastered, but at least strategically tried to construct their journeys around. Both locals and returnees referred to labor exploitation in terms of bad treatment by employers, primarily related to long working hours, some also deprivation of food. Actually, they talked a lot about not being allowed to eat enough. And many knew of someone or had heard of someone who returned with severe emotional problems, mental problems they call it. But they also knew of, and we could see in the villages, women who had decided to stay on and endure sometimes harsh conditions because of the salary, and who had constructed houses with water, plumbing and everything because of this. So I mean, everything is out there. Let me conclude by saying that gender affects the way migration unfolds, the risks faced prior to, during and after migration. I mean, we should not talk about risks as something that just occur in the moment that a woman leaves. It occurs long before that. So during and after migration, and it also, of course, affects the employment and protections, or the availability of that could interfere. In Ethiopia, the combined effects of long-term poverty, recurrent and protracted political conflict, and the impact of environmental change increases women's vulnerability to human trafficking for sure, but it doesn't automatically and necessarily lead to human trafficking. During migration and upon return, women who are forced to mobilize their existence by crossing borders, they may not immediately identify conditions associated with conflict or domestic problems as what had encouraged their migration. They will say we were poor, but may when you sort of start talking to them, talk about this poverty that goes through generations, and also debts that go over generations, the need to pay back debt. Vulnerability during travel arrangements seems to increase. We can actually see that when the decision to migrate is taken on their behalf, when fathers send young women, for instance, to migrate as part of a family strategy, it's usually more dangerous than when sisters or single mothers send daughters, not because fathers are evil and mothers are good, but because this is a women's labor market. So the networks among women do actually function as some kind of protection there. But as I will also argue, migration policies designed by sending and receiving states also have very direct consequences for how migration unfolds. So maybe that's what we should study. And it also has very unintended consequences. In many instances, the risk of human trafficking may rest as much on the fact that legal options for migration are limited, as on abuse suffered by the hands of human smugglers and traffickers. When abuse related to travel arrangement occurs, actually both officials and relatives may be involved. Studying such experiences over time, I would say, would allow us to see maybe the creative strategies migrant women employ in negotiating precarious positions, and how the trespassing of both legal and moral boundaries unfold over time. And why is this important? I think the trafficking label has very severe consequences for migrants and any attempt to assist them throughout their trajectories. And the politicization of the trafficking label has led to a systemic neglect of the significant exploitation of migrant labor in the countries of origin, but actually also in the countries of origin. Remember the minimum wage set that I mentioned in the free trade zones? I mean, $50 a month, come on. Who is then responsible for women going abroad to get a decent salary? There is therefore a need to reorient the analysis of migrant domestic workers beyond questions of legality, and I think this is particularly important when women are navigating poverty and precarity within informal economies. Women migrating for domestic work are often excluded from stable employment alternatives at home. Deploying an analytical lens that allows for agency and applying an economic critique of poverty as historical, structural, and gendered, I think would enable an understanding of domestic work abroad as a very different endeavor than most policy-oriented studies focusing on risk actually do. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Yes, please. You can come. Oh, you can come here, and I will stay here.
Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Then should I also self-present? I guess. My name is, Agnese Pacciardi. I'm a PhD student at Lund University in political science. I work on migration from West Africa, in particular Senegal, to the European Union. I look at the policy dimension, border externalization policies in particular, but I look at how people are affected and respond. So I wanted to thank you for this very rich and timely paper, and I think it speaks a lot also to a lot of dynamics that I'm seeing in Senegal with women that either aspire or have tried to migrate to Europe. I think one thing that you do very well is to bring attention to the gender dimension of mobility, which, as you say in your paper, are either completely overlooked. Most of the literature is absolutely male-centric, and when we think about the figure of the migrant as almost always a young, able-bodied male. And when women are included in most of the literature, they are reduced, as you're saying, to rather simplistic tropes. They are victims of trafficking, they are subjects in need of rescue, so they are framed almost always within this victimizing discourse. And I think you are challenging very much that with your paper, and this discourse we see not only in scholarship, but also and mostly in policymaking. And I think here your use of the concept of transpassing is very, very original, and it's super interesting because it helps us see how women are not only crossing borders in a geographical sense, and thus transgressing legal norms of what kind of movement is permitted and not permitted, but also, as you're saying, they are transgressing gender and social norms in their communities of origin, which is also something that I think it's very much absent again again from the debate. And I think bringing this factor in allows us for a more nuanced understanding of women's agency on the move, one that is very much rooted in local context and reveals how women, and I think I had the pleasure to read the whole chapter, and it's very rich ethnographically. So I think the stories that you bring us really reveal how women can strategize and navigate the constraints that are imposed on them, not only by border violence, and I really liked when you were saying that when we think about the risk in the language of, again, migration policies, especially coming from Europe, we often hear the portrayal of the journey as risky, but we often ignore that there are also risks in the community of origins, and so women, and this you show very well, are able to assess which risks they might be willing to take in order to have a better life, or what they think would or could be a better life for them. And relatedly, I think an important contribution of your work is the way it situates mobility within its broader sociocultural context, rather than treating movement as an isolated act. As you're saying, sometimes it's part of a family dynamics, and sometimes it's also a reaction to local imaginaries, gender obligations, patriarchal violence, and discourses of development and morality that circulates in local communities. And I think this provides also a much needed challenge to very Eurocentric models of migration. And because you're looking at a kind of migration that we could say is south-south, I don't know if you would define this as that, but this is how I see it. And I think this is also important because you show that mobility is not always Europe-bound. So this also challenges a lot of discourses that we hear constantly in from European politicians in all countries, I would say. And I had a few questions and reflections that I hope can contribute to the conversation. My first question, so perhaps I will read and ask all of them, and then you can also pick and choose the ones that you feel you can answer. My first curiosity was about programs for returnees that you only briefly mentioned at the beginning of your research. And the reason why I found that very interesting is because it resonates a lot with my own research in Senegal, also with this narrative of entrepreneurship and self-reliance that many of these programs have. And this discourse, which encourages individuals to stay home and make it, which is used both in programs for returnees and in programs for those that you also define as potential migrants, places the burden of reintegration squarely on the shoulders of individuals without offering the real structural support needed, right? In your case, you also said in the paper and also in your presentation that there were more than 200 women returnees, and yet the programs for returnees only could cover for a very, very small number. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how that works in Ethiopia, and also relatedly whether these programs for returnee also take into account the psychological dimension of return that you also mention a bit, including the stigma that returnees face, especially women, and especially in a context, as you're saying, where mobility is not considered something for that women should do, and also the debts that they incur during the journey that you also mention in the full version of your paper. So what I find in my research, and I'm super interested to hear whether you find the same in Ethiopia, is that most of these programs do not take into account these more social dimension of return, right? What people then find once they go back home. And I think this, and of course the fact that the aid that they provide is not sufficient, I think it's crucial for why, as you're saying, most of these women think about remigrating again.
I might not have time to answer more than that when I look at the clock.
Okay.
But if you have another quick one.
Yes. Well, let me choose. Okay, then maybe something that you also two ones, and then you can choose. So one is about human, like the conflation between smuggling and trafficking, and how the understanding of the context in Ethiopia is not really reflected in how the language of trafficking and smuggling is reflected in international conventions. And I would also say in the discourse that, again, we hear in European policies. So I was wondering whether you find that this discourse is also local in Ethiopia, and whether you think it might have been influenced by, again, European discourses that, of course, want to portray smugglers as the root causes of the problem. And last but not least, if you could just briefly say, because I think you are really bringing an Afrocentric feminist lens, which is very important because you are giving voices to women that, of course, do have voices, but you're amplifying those voices by bringing them in spaces like here where they might not necessarily have access. So I was wondering whether you could say something about how this approach could change the way we think about borders and mobility also in an Afrocentric sense. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I can say very briefly about the last question, that I think the way forward there would be to do joint work with African women. And I have my new project. I work with a brilliant Ethiopian women scholar, and I mean, co-publishing using that vehicle, I think it's much better than me bringing an African voice to this table. So I look very much forward to that. From the bottom again, the conflation between trafficking and smuggling. Yes, and I just finished another paper where I actually write about that and also use all the categories that the Ethiopians, I mean, I've had the help of Ethiopian scholars to help me translate these local terms that people use for little helpers, vehicles. There's sort of a lot of terms that they use. But when you come into a government office and talk to them, they will talk about trafficking. I mean, trafficking. Then I ask, so do you distinguish between human trafficking and smuggling? And they look a little puzzled and they say, yeah, how is it? Yeah, we do, but for referral, we always use trafficking. And why do they do that? They do that because of funding. I mean, obviously, that's where the money is, and Hope for Justice and other anti-slavery organizations are active, and the few funds available are there. So that, of course, influences the discourse. What also influences is, of course, that the European Union has had a large program, a lot of money poured into strengthening Ethiopian border control, training police officers, and there are now at the local traditional administrative level committees overlooking the mobility in and out of local communities. I mean, Ethiopia is very good at that, so I was really amazed how much local authority used these terms when talking to us, as if they wanted to demonstrate, really, we learned the lesson. But then when you looked at their houses, you thought, oh, you have a daughter in Saudi Arabia, because otherwise you wouldn't have had that roof. But of course, they wouldn't necessarily talk about that. The programs for returnees, in December, I did field work in 6 shelters in Ethiopia for returned women, victims of trafficking. So I interviewed some women with social workers present, of course, and I interviewed staff working in these shelters. The staff is mostly very wonderful and very aware of this whole setup. They know that these women are not all necessarily trafficked, but this is the only available option to give them some assistance. What are the programs? The programs are, as you say, rehabilitation, which is sort of psychological help, legal help maybe. Then it's training, entrepreneurship, become an entrepreneur. At the same time as the Ethiopian state is demolishing all the old neighborhoods in cities where entrepreneurs could perhaps make a little coffee shop or something, you are trained to do that, or hairdressing, or nails, or textile. And I mean, there's simply no market for that. And the NGOs know that. They talk about it. They are angry. But these are the programs that are. And the final step of the rehabilitation is family reunification, which is what troubles me most, actually, because half of these women have actually left very violent situations, and thinking that bringing them back to those conditions is solving a problem is simply the most abusive, I mean, that I can imagine. So I'll stop there. We can probably discuss a bit all the papers after finishing, but I think we should go on with Professor Amanda Hammar's presentation, and I will not do a long presentation of all her doings, but Amanda is a professor at the Center for African Studies at Copenhagen University, and she's my neighbor. And I think this is the first time we are on the same panel, isn't it? Which is funny. So I'll leave the floor to you, Amanda.
Glasses, microphone. This way or the other way around? This way around. This is very strange. Can you hear me? Is it on? Okay. So, thank you very, very much, first of all, to Natalia for inviting me. Thanks to Ninna for being a great neighbor, but also a great colleague and inspiring. We've known each other academically, actually, since 1997. So it's a long journey we've been on together. And I would just like to start by saying that Natalia very, very kindly invited me to be part of the book project, which unfortunately I had to decline because I am overcommitted as it is. But even at the time that you did ask me, I mean, there were these 3 terms in the African borders in motion. And I just wanted to say momentarily something about my relationship to these 3 keywords, Africa, borders, motion. So regarding Africa, I'm both an African and an Africanist. I'm Zimbabwean. Sustained my strong links to Zimbabwe for a long time, even though I've been in Scandinavia a long time as well. And I am a professor of African studies, so my involvement, my commitment, my relationship to the continent is extremely deep and sustained. Regarding motion or movement, I have had quite another era in my academic work where I worked on migration of internally within Zimbabwe of migrants from one part of Zimbabwe to another. I've worked with Zimbabwean white farmers who moved to Mozambique. I've worked on notions of displacement, political economies of displacement. So I have got a relationship to the notion of motion, mobility, movement, and so on. And regarding borders, I better read, see what I'm saying here. It's manifested in two particular ways. So on the one hand, I've done also urban research and worked with a lovely Norwegian colleague, Marianne Milstein, on the notion of juxtacities, which looks at the juxtaposition of differences and the divides between differences in urban spaces. So that's one kind of bordering, division, distinction that I've been very interested in for a long time. But the other side, not entirely separate from the logic of the juxtacities work, is I've been looking into forms, processes, and effects of differentiated citizenship. Differences, that notion of difference and what differences make in different contexts has been a long interest of mine. And it's manifested very much in the project that I've been leading for the past 5 years called Citizens, Certifications of Citizenship in Africa. You can see the little Citizens title, the thumbprint there. And this is we had to buy this image, pay for this image. It's on all our sort of Citizens presentations. So given that that's what I've been doing for the past 5 years with a wonderful group of people, 5 PhDs, 3 senior researchers, eventually 10 master students we also supported. There's a lot that I draw on. Unfortunately, not my own direct research because the Danish Research Council would not fund Zimbabwe. So we have worked in Ghana and Uganda. But just to say that the notion of divides, borders, motion, Africa, all come together in what I'd like to talk about today. But what I'm particularly interested in this presentation is the ways in which the hyper-technical, and I'm going to explain a little bit more about that, hyper-centralizing logics, politics, and practices of particularly digital and biometric national identification systems are reinforcing both old forms and generating new forms of citizen classification and differentiation. And what does this mean for border work and mobility? So the borders I want to focus on in the talk are classificatory borders rather than territorial ones. I'm not talking about, the border posts and so on. So I'm mainly concerned here with the social, cultural, and political economic borders or boundaries that are generated or changed through regimes of classification and categorization in relation to ID systems. And the fixing of these categories, and what does this work do? Of course it has implications for territorial boundaries and people's IDs and crossing and legality and illegality and identification, but I'm not going to be talking about that. The particular point about these more social forms of boundary making through classification, I won't keep saying classification and categorization, but they work together. So classification, I'll explain in a moment, and the difference. But the point about these social forms of boundary making is that they can and do act either as facilitating or constraining mechanisms, opening up or closing down, sometimes simultaneously, a range of social and physical mobilities. So this is what is of particular interest to me. Even before initiating the Citizens Project, I was interested in the significance of the relationship between IDs, national IDs, and a politics of classification. And in the 2018 publication on certifications of citizenship, which you could say is another term for national ID systems, I define certification in this way. It's a bit wordy. A multidimensional space in which various acts of classification, meaning constructing typologies of difference, and of categorization, meaning allocating hierarchical value related to difference, this a multidimensional space in which various acts of classification and of categorization manufacture and strategically apply the terms and technologies, I know it's a lot of words, of recognition, verification, and validation that govern lived citizenship. It's quite a dense definition, but that is both what I would say holds together the notion of certifications of citizenship, or, in another way, national ID systems. So this emphasis is on the establishment and naturalization of hierarchies of value, of differently defined and positioned people in relation to nationally defined territory or political community, such as a nation. And it in turn entails the institutionalization of systems that recognize, through various legal bureaucratic steps, the entitlements of given persons or groups of persons to become a statutory citizen. And this is then confirmed, at least in principle, when a recognized or verified person gets access to an actual national ID. So there's a lot in there, but it's not as if processes of registration, verification, validation, etc., automatically lead to an ID document. That's something I want to say more about. But the very nature of the state's sovereign authority rests in this kind of absolute monopoly, almost, of the dominant control over the means of recognition. It's a very significant part of state making itself, is this authority to recognize and validate and verify and certify and make available these ID documents. Lots of different steps involved. So at the same time as this assertion of authority, it sets the set of practices around all of these certification processes manifests attempts by states at legibility. We know that. It's about making visible or reading populations, surveying. So it manifests attempts by states at legibility, at certainty, or the illusion of certainty, and social ordering of its diverse national populations. So there's a lot that happens in this notion of IDs. We have phrases, as I'm going to talk about later, legal identity for all. It's a very catchy, appealing phrase, SDG 16.9, but what does it actually mean to say it, to offer it, to invest in it, to implement it, to see what it does and what it doesn't do? Of course, there are, given the complex and uneven effects of these certification identification systems on differentiated citizens, of course there are always acts of resistance to categories and classifications by those who are being defined by them. Yet paradoxically, as I've also noted in the same article, quoting myself here, even while citizens might actively oppose the worst aspects of their classifications or forced legibility, most prefer such disciplinary and sometimes violent inclusion to the cold isolation of absolute exclusion. So there's a kind of a weighing up there. So even for those who are intended to be included in these certification and identification systems, what we're witnessing widely across the African continent is that formal recognition and confirmation of citizenship through these various bureaucratic steps of verification, registration, and certification does not necessarily result in actual provision of the promised cards. And this is obviously, there are real resource constraints, there are capacity constraints in some instances, but in others, whether additionally or separately, there are deliberate differentiated exclusions. And we'll look at that in a moment in a case of Uganda and one particular ethnic minority. So, I've got a lot here about classifications and categorizations, which I think I'm going to have to skip. But let's just acknowledge that this kind of the politics of who is who, the politics of distinction is certainly not an old one. It's familiar, we've seen it in many places. I'm really trying to skip here because of time. So I'm just saying here, there's well-established scholarship on the many ways in which human societies, even from thousands of years back and all the way up to the present, have created and marked differences, cultural, social, political, economic differences between their diverse members, often written on bodies through scarification, through tattoos, through the wearing of masks, through other kinds of adornment. So it's an old story. Distinction, classification, differentiation. The forms of institutionalization and bureaucratization of individual and group distinctions at different scales is a little bit younger, but maybe centuries old. Many of these systems have been tested and consolidated in Africa during colonial times. We know this. But of course, in post-colonial African states, there have been other forms. So in Africa alone, in the last decades, we can reference systems of classification directly related to the production of identity documents that have had incredibly violent effects. We've got Rwanda, the genocide. We've got ethno-nationalist conflicts over Ivoirité and Côte d'Ivoire in the 2000s. Political violence related to ethnic and party political affiliation in Zimbabwe during the 1980s first, then the 2000s. Xenophobic violence in Nigeria in the early 2000s, and since in South Africa in 2008. We know that this happens. We know that these kinds of identifiable differences, these named and institutionalized differences, often through cards, through forms of ID, have two sides to them. They have the promise of citizenship, of all the rights and resources and accesses that come with it, and there is this very dark side. In all eras, in one way or another, what prompts and manifests these classificatory identification systems are shaped by a combination of social, cultural, political, economic, and increasingly technological dynamics. And you could ask, since we're saying this is a very common sort of phenomenon, what is it that we, both in citizens, but also more amongst the scholarship of the present, what is different? What is particular about the present? Because there are particular dimensions that are evolving right now because of a certain global conjuncture. And I'm going to talk more about this. Yep, I'm going to talk more about this now. Before I just put up on the screen these sort of dimensions of this present conjuncture, and there are many of them. When we first started our project, looking into it, developing it in 2018, we were looking at Ghana and Uganda, partly because the funding was available in those two countries, but we were looking at what was happening around national identification systems. And they were reforms that were incredibly interesting and dynamic. In the case of Uganda, 2014 was the first time that Uganda introduced a national ID system at all. It had many, decentralized forms, but 2014, it focused on a single national ID system, and that had profound effects all across the country in different ways. So that was a good case, we thought, interesting. On the other hand, Ghana had an individual national ID for a long time, but in 2017 they intensified increased the technical dimensions of the Ghana card with digitization and biometricization. So that was also it was bringing into play some new and we were interested in exploring. But we had no idea when we started in 2018 the scale of change, of effects of these various dimensions of the conjuncture, as I'm talking about, affecting the whole continent. So what are these aspects of the conjuncture? Starting with 9/11, the global securitization that it precipitated, that in itself coincided with various African national interests in security, in their own sovereignty concerns. And in that post 9/11 moment, this global push not only for tightening security, but for doing so through integrating advanced biometrics into identity documents. That already was, a first moment or first dimension. You're migration scholars, and as Nina's already said, that your project was on climate-generated migration. So alongside the whole securitization issue is the fact that there are growing conflicts, there's climate change crises, and this northern fear of migration, prompting even greater demands and promoting even greater forms of technological intervention to track, police, and control people on the move. In 2015, as part of the big SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, we have specifically 16.9, legal identity for all, including birth registration by 2030, itself a global traveling model. It's obviously linked to other kinds of acknowledgements of the rights of identity, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, etc. And it's definitely the kind of development goal, as I said, that one can't easily argue with or against. Yet its oversimplification, like so many development goals and policies, which includes the ones you've talked about trafficking, its oversimplification masks immense complexity and dangers, as always, mainly for those already marginalized. We then, at the same time, all sort of partly simultaneously, we have this incredibly fast-paced development of new generations of sophisticated digital technologies, which are looking for places to be tested, looking for markets, expanding, as some scholars talk about, expanding digital capitalism. And it does build a lot of what's emerged is built on the idea of the Aadhaar identification system in India that's promoted as a great success. So there's a lot going on there. At the same time, there's this broad, growing discourse of techno-modernity and the promise of development through digitization, through digital governance, through digital infrastructure. I mean, it's it's out there very substantially and repeatedly. And it also provides a new avenue for state legitimation. Let's be the modern, keeping up with, these kinds of technologies and this kind of digital governance discourse and promise of development through digitization has become a normalized and largely unexamined discourse in many development spaces. So again, there's an echo with what you were talking about, Nina, how you kind of get these tropes, these ideas, these, good policies, and then they just kind of have their own momentum, and they remain unexamined at the policy level, and then resources are attached to them, and investments, and this is definitely part of the digital ID system. On a, you could say more sort of straightforward positive note, with COVID, there was an intensification of the need for and speed of such systems regarding population data and its uses, and it did have some positive outcomes. So the fact that Togo, had already established some kind of digital population system, the Togolese government was able to very rapidly draw on a digital database to effectively roll out care services. And that in itself became a sort of a positive model, and they then received 500 million from the World Bank to introduce, of course, a national biometric ID system. This momentum and this kind of logic of moving in that direction, this techno-modern direction. But I just want to sort of conclude more or less with talking about, in this broad conjuncture, a coincidence of multiple interests. You have powerful global development actors, such as the World Bank, UN agencies, bilaterals. The World Bank is big on supporting digital IDs. There's a whole big program, ID for Development. UN agencies, bilaterals. You have lots of private foundations, big ones, the Gates of Media, promoting and investing in this technology. You have private high-tech companies, of course, these kind of tech vendors, digital ID vendors. You have the financial sector, MasterCard, others. You have influential policy interest groups. Probably you don't know, many of you, ID for Africa, which promotes itself as independent of the World Bank, and it has an extraordinary influence on the sort of promotion of digital IDs on the continent. You have digitization experts and advisors, this whole economy of expertise growing. And you have African states themselves seeking modernity and greater legitimation. So this conjuncture is ripe for the promotion, expansion of these kinds of digital systems. And on the continent, they're emerging, they're flowing in with fairly standardized solutions. Of course, there are great promises of the digital digital age in IDs, inclusive citizenship, formal recognition as citizens with dignity and rights, this language, inclusion in the nation, personal and equal protection under the law, increased provision and stable access to public services, a lot of talk about efficiency through the digital ID system, access to financial services, reducing fraud, verification for employment. And definitely this is being provided to a range of, you could say, millions of people on the continent in these different contexts. But little of it is being delivered in practice to very large, you could say, minorities. This is in the millions as well. So I'm going to jump all the way to the actual story of the Ugandan story, because my question is, so if all this is being promised, all this efficiency, all this inclusion and so on, where does the classification question come in relation to IDs, and what effect is it having? So of course you have major distinctions on the continent which are familiar to many. The indigene versus the non-indigene, that's an old one. Ethnicized, racialized or religious differences, party political or ideological differences, class, gender, sexuality, age-based differences. These constitute recurring themes and actual distinctions that get made. They get made on cards. You can see who is who, often on ID cards, and more so with digitized and biometric cards. But what then, let me just make sure here's my big question. What are the lived effects of the new digitized and biometricized systems in terms of the ways that classification is redefining and fixing new forms of distinction and prompting new forms of exclusion? I'll come back to that. So the Maragoli story, I'm going to give myself about 6 more minutes, 7 more minutes, if that's okay, Nina. 5 or 6. I've got more to say, but I'll have to keep it short. So the Maragoli are And this builds particularly on the ethnographic work of my colleague Torke Wolf, who we've co-written a paper together based on my work and his work, but this is his work on the Maragoli. So they are one of about 20 ethnic minorities that in the constitution of Uganda are considered non-indigenous, compared to 65 recognized indigenous communities. However, or at the same time, they have been there. Some of these communities started in the late 1800s, some in the early 1900s. They came with the building of the East Africa Railways and so on. The point being, they've been there for a long time and for generations. And until 2014, mostly they were living without fear about their status. They could, through the various forms, baptism cards, tax receipts, this, that, various kinds of LC1 letters of introduction, they could be recognized as, in a, maybe not a statutory way, but in a practical way, as citizens. They could access what they wanted. So this is really cutting this very short. In 2014, it was started through a security kind of concern in Uganda. It later became more developmental. They established this first national ID system. They had it had an NIN, a national identification number, and it was run by a former general who was then the Minister of Internal Affairs, who was very absolute about how this would be the only form of identification that would be valid. So in 2014, he says, he's quoted, "Without the national identity card, no one will be allowed to transact business, either in shopping malls or with banks, and even in churches. You will be required to produce your national ID in order to enter. If you don't register for national ID, you will not be allowed to enter the market, bus and church, and even taking your child for universal primary education." Pretty heavy, pretty absolute. So there was this immense campaign in 2014, 2015. In 2015, the National Identification and Registration Authority, NERA, was set up. You saw videos and them out in the field, and there were theatres, community theatres, and there was a poem that was written that school children should learn to recite called, what was it called? Make Me Known. Make Me Known. And it was meant to be taken out to families and so on. And it was the final verse of this poem was about connecting to growth, and the public discourse related to IDs asserted that the promise of a brighter future where all citizens would be made known through this new digital legibility, would offer them access to better services and better lives. Huge promotion. But ironically, being made known for the majority of Maragoli and similar communities within this new regime of digitized IDs would depreciate rather than enhance their lives. You have to give me 2 more minutes, Nina. A couple. So what happened in the course of these registration processes? There were these sort of temporary registration offices, some remain permanent, where people would have to come with their letters from the LC1, the local authority, with various kinds of other evidence of their who they were. Some of them had to bring, if not IDs of their parents, then the death certificates of their parents. One thing after another, the demands were enormous. They were exhausting, they were impossible. That's one set of sort of barriers. The other was for a lot of rural people, distances, the cost of travel, the queuing, etc., very problematic. But for Maragoli in particular, the point was, would they be recognized as citizens at all? So they would come, initially not afraid, but realizing they were being asked they were having language tests. They were being asked histories of the area in case they weren't really legitimate. And I wish I could read this to you. The point being that they were basically being targeted, being profiled, and being refused because they were not considered authentic citizens of Uganda. This had not been the problem for them before. So in this system of improving, I'm going to have to finish in a minute, improving, what it did was identify them and made them known in ways that really were harmful. And in some cases, they were threatened by neighbors who wanted to institute land grabbing. Some people's homes were burned. They went into hiding. They were really afraid of being visible, and they would also not take their own produce to market. They'd go through middlemen, etc. And the depletion of their lives was really constructed through this. So what's my last? Yeah. I really don't have time to finish this, do I? All right, I'll just read the last... I'll read the last paragraph. In conclusion, the Maragoli case reveals the often hidden dimensions and complex effects of such major digital governance reforms, and specifically the detrimental consequences of implementing narrowly conceived, digitized and biometricized national systems in such plural and layered societies. For many millions of Africans, such systems, in their attempts to construct illusions of certainty and stability and to legitimize forms of authority, albeit in the service of security, growth and welfare, are either sharpening old classificatory divides and hierarchies of difference or generating new ones. Thank you. Way too much to say.
Thank you, Amanda, for a wonderful presentation, and fortunately or unfortunately I didn't have a presentation to read, so I have not prepared questions as such, because I listened to this here, but that might allow us to bring in the public. But when listening to you, I mean, you get all these pictures, because this is just, I mean, yesterday I was interviewing Ukrainian refugees participating in the Folkemøde in Bornholm, and what they say different things, but what they say is, we really wish the Danish government could make a decision of whether we can stay or not. I mean, this temporariness, I mean, it's 3 years now. I mean, can we or not? So there's this, apart from sort of the control without provision, it was really what I heard. You know, this give governments a means to control their population if it is like in Denmark. I mean, if we then get social welfare, if we get free schools, if we get, okay, we accept the control. But the problem is, of course, if you give a government those means and it doesn't provide, I mean, that's a different thing. And that's also what I heard many of the people I spoke to yesterday saying, you know, I mean, you can control. I mean, you may not be able to send us back, but you can control that we are not included, that we cannot this, that we cannot that. So I think that's a very interesting thing in your presentation. So this relationship between control and provision would be something that maybe you could elaborate on. The other part you hinted on, which I find really interesting, is sort of the importance or impact or effects of corporate interests. Because, I mean, the World Bank is doing these identity programs also in Ethiopia, funding them with, I mean, partly by grants, 1/3 grant, 2/3 loan, right? And there, as in the Ugandan case that you mentioned, I mean, the promise is provision. I mean, now we will register so that everybody can have, I mean,
good services.
But they don't have it before the register. I mean, you can see that social protection programs reach like 5% of those in need, that schools are deteriorating, that people don't pass exams because the system is really not good enough because it's not funded enough, right? So I mean, there needs to be some service delivery and security, of course, in this. So maybe, yeah, and that was a little deviation actually from the corporate interest, because I think that these high-tech giants out there are also really pressing, and it's an enormous market. I mean, it's an enormous market. There's a lot of earnings to be made, and there's also a lot of earnings to an new upcoming middle class in African countries who have taken these digital educations. So what I find, at least in Ethiopia, without working on your issue but discussing it, is that there is a fairly new, just clinging on to middle class status, African layer that see modernity in this issue and a business opportunity. So there is also like a social contract maybe between governments and this very small little urban middle class, that, I mean, we give you this, you support us. Question mark.
Okay, thanks
I
a
will
lot,
leave it
Ninna.
there.
Okay. The first thing I want to come to is the notion of, you say, the control versus provision. I think what the word that really I keep coming back to is the promise. Do you remember, it was Monique Neuken's The Hope Generating Machine?
Yeah.
This is another hope generating machine, and it's in a new form. It's not, world-class cityism is one thing, techno-modernity, the phones, the M-Pesas, the this is that. But this promise is not just services. I mean, that, people are very aware that, capacity to deliver services is actually quite limited. But it's a verification of who you are. That's part of it. It's like a formalization of citizenship, especially when you have those kinds of messages. So if you have those kinds of messages, on the other hand, you need someone, a state that's going to offer you the means through which you are able to access things, even the basics, even your children going to school, etc. So I think that even if people know that there are limits to what is going to be promised in terms of service provision, if you've lived with it, it's not going to arrive very soon. So this idea, as I said in one of the quotes, people are willing to sign up, which means becoming legible, which means being controlled or monitored or being able to be policed in favor of the basics that you can. Maybe you'll be protected. Maybe you'll be, protected within the law, or recognized as a citizen, or able to go to market without having to go through a middleman. So I don't think it's an either or on the control or provision. I think there's this kind of, I wouldn't call it a social contract directly, but maybe it is partly that, of a sort of implicit, explicit, what kind of things are we going to get? And I don't think people have illusions particularly. So, and the other side is that knowing that they can't get what they are promised, that the card isn't coming, and in the case of the Maragoli, what people are doing is circumventing. So not all, but some went with, they invented names, they went to other districts, they gave their children to other families to register them in those families. So, there are ways in which people will be active citizens, insurgent citizens, to try to claim what is still being on offer. Because once you do get the card, and some Maragoli through these means got those cards, their lives changed. They could access bank accounts, they could get loans, they could get pensions, they could, So it's not exactly a cat and mouse, because we know who the cat is, and it's a big, noisy, loud, fat cat. but there is some dynamic. There are some dynamics there. The fat cat metaphor actually does relate to capitalism, and corporate interests and alliances between the World Bank and states and the elites, not just the emerging middle class, but it's so interesting for elites in these various African countries to sign up to this. There's money, there's status, there's investments, there's, as you say, there's a lot going on in African contexts themselves in terms of businesses. And I mean, those businesses are not necessarily small, informal businesses, not for this kind of work. It's elites that are owning or co-owning, sharing those businesses. So there's an incredible alliance between these kinds of actors. And there's no doubt, I mean, that's why, when I said it's not new, the ID, the classification, the sort of marking, whether it's on the body or, digitally, eventually there'll be a chip in our bodies, no doubt, whatever. It's not a new story, but this is a new story. This confluence of old stuff and hyper-technologizing and digitizing and biometricizing, that's kind of new. That's really the last couple of decades. And with, SDG 16.9, it's sort of all legitimized more and more. It's not just the security discourse, it's the development discourse. I think the other thing, what did you that I wrote down, partial, you were talking about Ukrainians here being sort of stuck or in between, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is a context for all refugees or all asylum seekers, the sort of middle purgatory almost, that in limbo that people are in. But I'm sure that also for Ukrainians here, as for partial citizens, even legal Ugandans who don't get their cards, is a kind of partial citizenship that you live with, you work around, you wait, but there's this hope-generating machine that somehow, someday, this will include me as well. So, I think I'll end with that.
But thank you so much, Amanda, and we we will discuss this more. I mean, we are in good time for a coffee, right? And then there will be one more presentation, and then we can have a joint discussion before lunch. But thank you so much, Amanda.
Nina. Okay, cheers.
It's after the third presentation. Sorry, I was promising coffee. It's my own need for coffee. I'll survive. So we have the third presentation. Are you giving that? So please welcome my colleague. We also know each other for a long time, since the late 90s maybe. So Natalia Ribas-Mateos is a Spanish scholar attached to the Autónoma in Barcelona with this particular program. Please, floor is yours. And we have a discussant online for this presentation.
Thank you so much, Nina. Thank you very much. This cannot be bigger here. Like you can, I can move. Okay, we just leave it like this, then I'll put it down. Yeah, you can also do like this, okay. Not with this, okay. Thank you. Just a moment, I have so many things. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for all the presentations this morning. I mean, it's been incredible. These new concepts that I think for us is going to enrich a lot. Like the general scope, the conceptual part, the methodology, etc. It's given us, I think, a lot of feedback in how to rebuild the book. So that was a bit the idea, and I think the expectations had been great, Nina, with your concept of transgression, and then and Amanda would say I was thinking like the Hannah Arendt of Zimbabwe in this analysis. So it's been very, very enriching. Thank you very much. Now the exercise is going to be very different because I'm kind of presenting a table of contents. So, and the time is much less. So, and we have many things to say. So we'll do like an exercise how to say, too many things in a very simple way. That would be the idea. How to show you what's going on in 20 minutes. So the idea is we are kind of thinking like a mechano way, we have so many topics and so many chapters and everything. So we'll try to find a way how to, to fit those topics into you, but like very quickly, very superficially seen, of course, but at least how this mechano is building, because we are still building this kind of a mechano articulation, no? So that would be the idea. How are we going to see this mechano articulation? First, I'll just read a little bit of a text that I thought it makes you think about how we have to think in a new ways. We have to be on the move, no? In the way of how we think about globalization, Africa, African borders, etc. How we can find new ways. We'll just start with like a fragment of a text that I think, to me, made me think, of this need, how we need to think about new ways of, approaching things. Then I will just quickly show you some themes that they are covered in the introduction. Of course, just showing the themes that they are covered. Some things new things that they have been added, through the discussions and the conferences also in Casablanca and Saint Louis, more or less, just like very enumerated, of course, themes. And finally, we'll see the articulation of how, people, a setting, people, authors, chapters, a setting into the themes, also very quickly seen. You'll see, for example, here, Mpongo, it means an author, this is a theme, it's not very clear maybe, and this is like the keyword and the area. So author is in yellow, place is in blue, and chapter, the keyword is in green, more or less. But it's, I thought it would be clearer, but anyway, I'm just remaking this by hand because the people keep changing. No, I'm out. I change my topic. No, I rebuild my chapter. So that's why we are, just working on this. Like a three working process kind of thing. Okay. And the last point, it will be, just to say like one of these examples that we have in the chapters. So it will be Agnese who's present with us. Agnese will show you very quickly her example. That would be the way. So we would have an example of an author in present. This Italian scholar, what's his name? Giorgio Blundo. He does a film review about a film about Africa in 2020. about the. It's a film called that I have not seen it. I'm just talking about the reference. Days of Cannibalism, of Pioneers, Cows and Capital. And he says, Africa is too far. An African importer tells his Chinese suppliers to justify his request to check his sunglasses order again. Sometimes you guys pack something that I didn't need. We are in one zoo, somewhere in the Xiaobei district, where thousands of traders from Africa, the Middle East, and South America converge to purchase the low-end commodities that are produced by the country's countless factories scattered around the Pearl River Delta. The opening of the documentary Days of Cannibalism bears a striking resemblance to another recent documentary on China-Africa relations, From Below. But if the two films share the same critical look toward global millennial capitalism, the parallels end there. After the short Cantonese prologue, the film plunges us into the cold and arid mountainous eddies of Lesotho, a small kingdom embedded in the belly of South Africa. Here too, China is very far away, embodied by a few migrants who have come to make the fortune in the retail or wholesale trade, in the restaurant business, or in the mining sector. Filmed in CinemaScope like a Western, Days of Cannibalism questions the Chinese presence in Africa in an original and sui generis way, while it takes from the Western genre the harsh and austere setting, the presence of pioneers in search of a better life, cattle rustling, strict and expeditious justice, and a scene of rare violence, which will not reveal. The film is not focused on the clash between two communities. Thanks to his knowledge of Lesotho, where he grew up, and his privileged relationship with some Chinese families, etc., the relationship between Chinese migrants and indigenous Basotho is portrayed. I cut pieces, In this context of apparent incommunicability, the announcer of a local radio station plays the role of a cultural broker, encouraging the natives and the Chinese to learn from each other, the Chinese to look after the cows, the Basotho to trade and make money. The filmmakers show that it's possible to describe Sino-African interaction in a more nuanced and sensitive way, without the mediation of a Western gaze, and above all, without falling into cliches about Chinese predatory neocolonialism. In the final scene of this beautiful, strange, and unclassifiable film, emaciated cows munch on the carcasses of their fellow creatures. In the final analysis, who are the cannibals? Just quickly to make us think, like other ways of, how to put, like Africa in the global change of what we are seeing nowadays, because I think that was very important to us, like to see African borders, from an African perspective, but also not only that, but to think about to examine Africa in order to talk about the world, so about what's happening today, not only, always, like to repeat Africa, and even if history is important, of course, but just not to be repeating every time, like the historical and the stories of colonialism that we know it, but in so many ways. So we wanted to think about other ways of how to think about this African in the move by putting African in the African borders in the move in the center of our analysis of globalization changes. So let's go then now to the topics and the introduction. So the introduction starts with a state of the art that touches many topics, but it was a way of, like following many of the books that we have on borders on the wall, or we had done edited books, borders in the Middle East, borders in the Mediterranean, etc. So it was a kind of a continuation, a kind of a trilogy of borders in the world kind of thing, to tell you very quickly. Then there was a second point of cartography, saying that place matters, and we did. I wanted to show all these maps, but we don't have time, but this it's going to be like a backup of cartography, like to illuminate the disputed and conflicted borders, all the connections with the global maritime routes in this circulation, in this, like a global cartography of connections. All these forms of circulation in the world economy, and why looking at Africa makes us, understand many things about these circulations. And then we pass through general objectives and key topics of exploration. Of course, they are the history, like the legacies of the colonial borders, etc. But we tend to look at these new and old borders, and new and old borderlanders, no? So like not only mobilities, we're not only talking about border mobilities, but many other topics, which is like, for example, people who live in community areas, no? Like all the, and we take into consideration all these studies of borderlanders that they are mainly produced in the Mexico-U.S. border, no? What it's like a border community, in economic levels, identity, in the identity, belonging, etc. Then big topics we have here: gendering of mobilities, as like maybe on the line, if you want, of what Nina had described, but with different cases. Of course, we'll see it in the chapters. Then there's a big topic also that it would take ages to describe, but it's on knowledge production. On knowledge production, because we take the level of the academic level, and also we take the activist grounding, the traveling context also of this, knowledge production from one place to another, and then finally the activist grounding, and the activist part, which it would be also very rich to develop, but that's going to be the session tomorrow. The session tomorrow we do, if somebody is interested, we'll give you the Zoom also link. We'll do it from Copenhagen tomorrow, but the main organizers will be in Las Palmas de Gran Canaria. So they've chosen, there's an African activist, I only know one of them, so for me it's also a surprise, that will be talking of, like on borders, human rights defenders in border context. Okay, so there's the part of knowledge production, the part of economic and environmental dynamics, violence. There's a lot of, we talk a lot about also the issue of violence at borders. The global influence and the local reading, interplay of these dynamics, the humanitarian and ethical considerations in borders, etc. So that's a long list. Then maybe from this huge list, in Casablanca and St. Louis seminars, I think other themes came up which are very important. These South-South connections are much more complicated than we can think about it, and we saw it in, like in the terrain there in through these simultaneous seminars. So we have to review these kind of connections. We have to review the conflicts also in these connections, because we had just to tell you an example, we had many problems already also. I don't know if you remember, Papa, for example, when there's an Italian presenter online that he presents with a map, the map of Africa was cut it once, but the worst was when the map of Morocco did not include the Sahara, and we were there in the, like in the room there, everybody going crazy in the room, how to, and the Italian didn't know what was happening online in Italy, in Sicily. So just to give you some examples of how we have to be consider these topics, and another topic, I will not give more examples, but that would be take a long time. There are like examples that they have not been, researched enough. For example, like the legacy of the African slaves in Morocco. There are some books and everything, but I mean, they need to have enough information about this. So that created also problems in the debates. For example, people say the typical, the Tunisian talking from the fieldwork in Tunis and saying, here we are living like a situation of extreme racism, and he's doing field work there, the professor, and then the Moroccans say, no, Morocco is different, here we are very nice to African migrants, something like that, to tell you quickly. So these polarizations were very complicated to manage in the debates. Okay, so that's all. Then other topics that they are not fully included, and we have to include, is like the concept of extractivism, and given more examples of extractivism. We have one, I think, about Nigeria, no? Papa, if I don't remember, but we need maybe to reflect more on a general level on this concept, and more or less, and then the concept, I would also underline the concept of filters, like this idea of filters. Well, I normally use this concept coming from also the Mexico-US border region, because I've done a lot of research there, and I use a lot of bibliography from the US-Mexico border region. But this anthropologist, Hammar, that works on the concept of filters, and how filters uses, it serves you to understand classifications, to understand border mobilities, etc. So how, like the concept of filters, it can be like also a key, like a theme, to organize the chapters, etc. But said that, like you say she's trying to organize the table of context, and how did they organize, like when we had the proposal, we had an organization of the table of concepts, and it was more or less nicely put through the different regions, so using a regional scope, North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, South Africa, etc., so Central Africa. So that was very clear. But now, like a step by step, we have seminars and discussions and different people, so they keep changing. And now, today, even if I'm saying that I'm presenting the table of context, we didn't give the final distribution. So we only use the table of context by surname of main author, because they keep changing so much that it's very complex. So we will wait until maybe July, when we have a clean, like a folder of chapters, and then we will distribute them again. So if we see them on the screen here, so that's what's a conceptual map for African borders in motion. So, for example, here, let me see if I can, this I cannot do like this, no. With the pen, no, it's like this. Okay. No, just here. Here, I'll just move around. Do you see, for example, a conceptual map for African borders in motion? You have the global, for example, people who work on free circulation, free movement, And so it would be Jolar with the example of Togo, Raimundo with the example of Mozambique and Malawi, Togo and Willy using global actors in general, etc. Then we have examples, for example, on humanitarian compassion politics in a contemporary understanding. You have Artigo with an example of beyond the state center border, and she works on the case of Ghana, Burkina. If we're thinking about a cartography, we have roots, border cities, ECOWAS, African regions, provincialization. I think it's not very clear to you, no? You can. Okay. No, but I'm just saying, you cannot see, you cannot read properly, no? Okay, so, okay, just to finish, okay, so then, but here you can, afterwards, if anybody is interested, you can see it here, because we went through it like this, and it was very interesting. We did the doctoral, seminar, we went through all the scales in Casablanca, so you could understand very well each, how you put each person in each region and each keyword in it. So just to tell you, just the mapping was the global attributes, cartography, methodologies, and themes. More or less it was like this, and it was all articulated there. Yes, yes, yeah. I'm just, and so that's the main idea. And of course now it's the example, and then we have after the example there's the discussion also, which is going to be connected online. Is Anitta. She's going to do a discussion after her reading of the introduction and all that. So let's see one of the examples of these three. Just mention your example, like just mention it, if you like.
Okay, then I will not use the presentation, or? No, just 5 minutes? Okay, then I will... yeah, I will try my best. So my chapter, it's about, as I was saying before, I work on the effects of border externalization in Senegal and how people, both those who move and those who don't, but are nevertheless affected by these policies, also react. So what I'm going to talk about in this chapter are different ways in which women, both who are on the move and women that are part of the families of people who move, are affected and react. So I use this lens of im/mobility to, as many other scholars have done, to understand mobility and immobility always as relational. Because I think that on the one hand, we should not see states of movement as definitive. People are not either always on the move or always stuck or immobile, right? For most people, actually, these are, and I'm not only talking about people in Africa, I can also talk about myself as a migrant in Sweden. We are constantly moving, right? So I think also labels such as returnees, as also Nina was saying in her chapter, are sometimes inaccurate because it presupposes a permanent state of being back in supposedly one's own country. So I will look in the chapter are 3 different ways in which immobility plays out for women in Senegal from a gender lens. So in the first part of the chapter I will, and this was very, very similar to what you were writing, so a bit about aspiration and how mobility is seen as a way to emancipate themselves, either from gender violence, from violent setting, violent marriages, but also just as a way to find autonomy. And build a life that most of these women feel they cannot have in their context. And then the second part, I will look at how gender follows them in their trajectory, and I'm looking at especially the journey by boat throughout the Atlantic, and how gender follows them on the boat. So how gender can be both an opportunity and a constraint. So how women can instrumentalize their vulnerability to get better prices or to get on the boat for free. Again, these are dynamics where the journey is organized by networks and families and not really the professional smugglers as we would see in North Africa, but also how these can also be a constraint in the sense that, for instance, women are not considered, like their opinion are not considered as valid as the ones of men while they're on the pirogue. I have this very telling example of this woman that was saying how she was trying to convince her fellow travelers to continue the journey as they were very, very close to the Canary Islands. But in the end, the men were deciding, because she did not have experience in navigation, so eventually they turned back. And she was saying how another boat that was traveling with them arrived just the day after. So this is just an example, and I have many others. And then the second part is about daughters and wives of people who went unfortunately missing at sea. And again, I show how these places a very big burden on women, so how the effects of the mobility of a male family member are very much gendered, and also how they manage in many different ways to exercise their agency, also within very constrained spaces of autonomy. And then the last part will talk about mothers of people who lost their lives at sea. And again, I show how they bear a triple burden, both, of course, the unbearable loss of an unnatural loss of a son, the material consequences that they have to bear, and the stigma of the society that accuses them of pushing their sons to go on the journey. But then I also show how some of them, in particular I've worked with 2 collectives of mothers in Senegal, are able to instrumentalize their motherhood and turn vulnerability into a source of agency by forming this women collective where they both together and collectively strike back against the carelessness of the border regime, and also manage to attract Europe funding by appealing to the humanitarian rationale of borders and the gender mainstreaming agenda of many non-governmental organizations. So they are able to attract money and also to promote a different image of women within their communities, because with this money they get status and they become someone within their communities. So I hope I stayed in the 5 minutes. It was very difficult, and I hope you understood at least a little bit of the chapter. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm here. Here, now I'm on? Yeah. Yes. We are having a coffee break now.
Oh, am I here to comment something or not?
Then the program is totally different from what we've... no, we are not. Okay, I'm giving over to you, Anitta. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I can't really hear when you are not talking to the mic, but... So I asked in the chat that, do I actually have time to comment if you are having the coffee break?
Please go on.
Okay. Okay, so thank you very much, and thank you, Natalia, for presenting the mind map, which I think is one illustration of how ambitious this project is. And well, I'm not going to take much of time introducing myself, but I'm actually saying that, 20 years ago, basically, I met Natalia for the first time in a conference that she was organizing in northern Morocco, in Tangiers, on gender and mobilities. And 10 years ago, I was working in the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala. And I'm saying this because this is also of how I come to this project and come to these questions about when we talk about Africa and the African continent. And I think what we've learned to ask over time is the question on which Africa and which African. And why I wanted to mention this connection to North Africa, the Morocco connection, the country in which where I've worked for the longest, and my discussions there over time, when Morocco was not really claiming an African identity as such, or Moroccans were not identifying themselves that much as Africans. I mean, many of those I interacted with. And I think that then also was very much connected when I started my work in Uppsala, the Nordic Africa Institute, which had practically focused on sub-Saharan Africa until then. So North Africa was separate. And that was the reason why I was hired there, I was told, to develop this North Africa research, given that it had this continental focus. And here, when I was looking at the table of contents, given that this ambitious ambitious aim to cover the continental concerns, and really think the world from the African continent, as was mentioned in the mind map as well. I would be curious to hear how you began the project. I mean, Natalia, you were explaining in your presentation how you had these different regional divisions between different parts of African continent. And then, of course, like over time, people have different priorities and change their focuses and all that. But if you want to tell a bit of the project of how you began to attract authors or to invite authors to participate or participants in this project, and how to take into account this massive diversity in the African continent. Well, massive size of the continent on one hand, and then like this linguistic diversity, which like I've encountered quite often, given that I work in both English and French, but I'm not fluent in Arabic, let alone many of the languages that people who participate in my research activities actually master. So then, so basically like how to connect with such a, or try to encompass such a diversity in the first place. And this then, another question is then connected to this, which African, I mean, very much connected to which Africa question, but then also of this ambition to combine activism, participation and governance. And I think this often, I mean, I can then maybe share another bit of information of my own self, because like I'm a tenure track professor in social research in Tampere, but I've always also served in this Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Network board for 6 years between 2012 and 2018, and engaging mainly with civil society actors back then, but always combining this with my academic profession. And I've many times encountered, well, for that network's purposes, mainly in Northern Africa, if we think of the African continent, but then also of these like differences in positionality, the kinds of things that people are able to say and share, and what they probably don't in a given context. And you mentioned the example from the Moroccan map, which is of course a highly controversial issue, and let's say that like human rights activists within Morocco have had different takes on how openly they would contest the official reading of the map in that context. But then, like, how do you, as editors of and leaders of this project, how do you cope with such diverse positionalities and demands that people need to come by with when working at particular locations. But thank you very much. I think I will stop here because the time is running and you need your coffee break on site. But thank you very much for this opportunity to participate and comment in.
Thank you. I will just answer very quickly, so not to take so much time. Thanks a million. I mean, it's been very interesting, and I think because we're going to see each other in Uppsala, so we can continue this kind of debates also in Uppsala. It would be very nice, you know, like to recuperate this for Uppsala. I suppose Papa thinks the same. I don't know. Okay. So just for the African scope, you know, and to be, is it okay? No? Yeah, I'm just starting the sentence. I'll just give 2 sentences. Okay, thank you. For the African scope, how can we explain it in 2 sentences? In 2 sentences, I would say it responds to networks. So network could be, you know, I think mostly Papa saw in the Western African network. Then it would be Henri, Yambene, and the Central African network. And with me, I try to do my best with the African, North African Maghreb network and the Italian connection also with Sicily, etc. More or less, I think that they come from that. And the other, sometimes, you know, like these people that you start like looking and finding and doing Google. Some people, you know, like they don't come from our network, so they just appear on the way. Meanwhile, you do the seminars or things like that. That's all. So, and then the activist issues are like a very long one. Maybe we can continue it in also in Uppsala. But I think tomorrow will be like a great, you know, like occasions to work on this. How we talk to each other. The real activists with the real. I mean, real. I'm saying that they are not double with the academian. People. That's all. I think that's all. Thank you so much. Have a nice coffee.
Yeah, well, thank you, Anitta. Thank you so much for these comments, and I'm sure we will take them with us for the more private part also of today in the afternoon. I just want to say there's a coffee break that I've introduced several times because I was up early. But there's a third academic presentation of our dear colleague Papa Saw from the Nordic Africa Institute of Uppsala, who will be talking about the epistemology of African borders. So we look very much forward to that, and welcome to you, Papa. But let's have a coffee before we continue. Is the mic on? So welcome back from this very short, way too short coffee break. Thank you for staying. We will have a presentation by Papa Saw just in a few minutes. Before that, I just want to say that there will be a little sandwich when we finish here for those who wish to join us for that. And I said at the very beginning of the seminar that we have a technical problem with comments coming from those participating online. So if you are online and wish to comment or ask a question, please write me an email. My email is nns@diis.dk. And I will check if there are any questions there. There weren't any this far. But should you have, don't feel excluded. I will then read them. But now it's time to introduce Papa Saw, a very distinguished African scholar working out of Uppsala, the Nordic Africa Institute. I'm known of your work for many years on migration, and also your like many other of us, now looking also at climate and climate mobility. So we look very much forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Like so.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me here at DIIS. That is a center that I heard several times, and then I met several people who told me about DIIS, and I never been to DIIS. And then even at NAI, I have colleagues from Ghana who tell me that say hello to Ninna, like George Bob Miller. I don't know if you know him. Yes. Okay, this is a part of a chapter that I want to present in this ambitious book, as somebody said, which is discussing about some what I call border spaces and some epistemic challenges. Okay, I'm not going to talk about all the chapter. I'm just, as I told to Natalia, I will pick up some issues from this chapter, because this is in fact the book chapter update. It is revolving around 5 main points, obviously an introduction, methodology, research, the notion of border space, where I talk about places and linkages and territories, all the differences. It's too complicated. I don't want to come back on this here. Border places are social production processes, and now there is a wind of sovereignty in Africa blowing, in the Sahelian African countries, and then even in my own country in Senegal, where people are very proud to be sovereign and to have a political sovereignty. And then the fifth point will be about epistemic decolonial borders and methodology challenges. I think this is where I will be focusing. And in my chapter, I ask those kind of questions. What is the political, economic, social, and cultural significance of borders in West Africa? I know many books have responded partly to this. Do current borders alter the body of knowledge we had on them, about them? How can we interpret and understand the current epistemic challenges related to borders? This is what the final point of my chapter want to discuss on. Obviously, this is a ongoing current chapter that could change along the process, as all chapters do. This is just images to show you how impression of a border. This is the Senegal River that divided Mauritania to Senegal. Before, the border was in 100 kilometers inside Mauritania, but in the independencies with Senghor, they decided to put the border in the middle of the river. So we are in the right side, and Mauritania is the left side, because this is geographical determination, how the current river is going toward the sea. And just to show you, like here, this is this is the infrastructure governing the river Senegal, OMVS, and this is a dam providing electricity that is also in the river, and we have several infrastructures like this that we share with Mauritania. That is just pictures to show how borders are important, how they can play a role in shaping new knowledge system, identities, belief structure. As Africa continues to grapple with the legacy of colonialism, I think we cannot talk about borders without talking about colonialism. It's evident that Natalia said in this book we are not going for a deeper criticism to the colonial thinking, but I think in Soham we could come back to the colonial things when we explain things, because that is important. The epistemic significance of borders should be a crucial area of proper research and reflection, fostering the emergence of a discipline. I would say we would have like what I call a science of borders, not just putting it in in a framework of disciplines. The epistemic challenges are numerous, but we will focus here on few major aspects that seem fundamental and relevant to the current times that we are living now in West Africa. I remind that my chapter is trying to scope out West Africa and not to go to other part of Africa. The colonial origins of African borders and the impact on knowledge system have been the subject of a lot of criticism. I think everybody knows Achille Mbembe, who is our mentor in borders in Africa. You also have several works from France, like Tassin, and most recently Hernandez, who also explained about this criticism. There is therefore a need for me to reappropriate local knowledge system and to question the restrictive framework imposed. This is also just pictures that I want to show. This is the border between Senegal and Mauritania, and now this is, they call it the Rosso border. And if you see even the map, you can see it where it is located. And in this border, they are now building a big bridge funded by the World Bank and other financial institutions of Europe also. And this is a very important passage of people and goods from Mauritania, and this is the biggest frontier that we have between Mauritania. I could also talk about the Gambian borders, but just to give an example of this. This questioning should be deeper and take example of how border spaces can shape the production and dissemination of knowledge from educational system, linguistic policies, and cultural aspect. Their spaces cannot be limited today to a simple corpus of knowledge to be integrated into disciplinary framework, but they must be better educate beyond disciplinary contingency. That is what I was explaining before. I mean, on the continental scale, we have the example of African Continental Free Trade, which is called AFTA, which is new, and which came into force in 2029 under the auspices of the African Union agenda. They have an agenda called 2063, and that could be a first milestone at the macro level. And AFTA already reflects a clear desire to transcend existing borders and create original cooperation based on interconnected integration zone. And I think this is very interesting for Amanda. Now, after want to unify an unified digital market that would address some economic integration, like e-commerce, regulations, promoting digital inclusion, and securing on the ecosystem of businesses and consumers. This represents a real potential on a continent where the youth that is sometimes targeted very badly, for me is a very important resource that has not yet been fully exploited economically and socially. And so this is very important also. So those imported and non-native language linked to the colonial past continue to marginalize the true dynamics of cross-border spaces. We have what we call Francophone, Portuguese, Anglophone countries speaking, for example, that are still real problem of misunderstanding between people in terms of administrative documentation and compliance with regulation. I think we have a good article of our friend Jorge Malheiro, who will talk about villagization of the Portuguese colonies. That is how, as you were saying, Amanda, how territories are built internally. I mean, We have it in Senegal, territories between white and black, mestizo and black, mestizo, and those kind of territorializations and border spaces are also important to sometimes document. The lack of harmonization of administrative procedures create tensions in border area, but also limit access to information and education. I'm investigating a lot between the three borders of Niger, Benin, and Burkina Faso, and seeing this kind of differences where people want to go to study in other countries, but I mean the border is an obstacle. Those kind of things. Obstacle in terms of structural deficient, like the infrastructures or linguistic inequalities that undermine access to cross-border educational institution and cultural linkages. This is we have those kind of disparities in access to knowledge that must be seriously considered when also studying borders in West Africa. This is typical pictures. I think also in our book we will talk a lot about violence, jihadism, and if we take some regions in West Africa also, we have this. Like we have the problem with Nigeria, Cameroon, even in my own country, the problem of Casamance. That is now very slowed down, but we had it a long time and it was very difficult. And we have now all the jihadism between the Triple Point region, between Niger, Mali, and Burkina. That's also they're struggling a lot to fight. And then the most curious thing is jihadist people or no armed group, they want the borders, because the borders do have the biggest reserve of forest, so they are sanctuaries of ultimate retrenchment where they stay and develop their strategies. Then now I want to talk about the methodological challenges. That it should be noted that the first one could be linked to that of legitimacy and how borders are perceived by the local population. Since the borders currently existing were in fact drawn by European colonial empires, there is therefore a neglect or ignorance in the different borders use, but also of local social and cultural dynamics that do not always respect the so-called informal borders. I think there's a lot of literature on this. Failure to take these hazards into account can lead to a lack of legitimacy perceived by communities, local authorities, and even by some states as a serious matter. We have here examples: conflict, jihadism in the Sahel with non-state armed elements, such as the one of Jinim. It is a very organized group that fueling all these strategies with different subdivision groups in Niger, Benin, and Burkina Faso. You have the Boko Haram. I think you witnessed the violence that Boko Haram was using with these women, capturing women, taking them as hostages and young people and young girls. They have also this politic of extortion and kidnapping that they do. We have the climate change issue, and then the economic crisis that can also affect border stability. Cross-border instability, I have explained Benin, Burkina, and Niger. You have tensions related to resource management between countries. The problem of Bakassi between Cameroon and Nigeria, or the resurgence of illicit trafficking in different products. Senegal, Gambia, we have this. You have also Benin, Nigeria. I think one of the chapters will be looking at the illicit oil trafficking between Nigeria and Benin. So how Beninese people go to Nigeria in this clandestine petrol world, and then they have the petrol and they sell it back in Benin. And the government of Benin is seeing all this, but they cannot stop them because it's a living for the people. You know, if they stop this, maybe they try to put a kind of law to regulate this, but it is sometimes very, very difficult to fight against this. This poses a real security issues and serious risk for research, because the disputed cross-borders area define climate territorial properties and access to natural resources like water, land, minerals, which represent essential means of subsistence of those people living in this cross-border areas. It is in fact the relationship with the environment and the rights to resources for those people that are undermined. The consequences are devastating, and they negatively impact the collection of accurate data, disrupting exchanges that can escape official statistics when conducting like quantitative surveys, or I mean, now in those kind of conflict you cannot even undertake longitudinal studies. So I remember I visited during several years the north of Benin, but now I cannot go there because NII would let me go at the north of Benin. And then what I do, I have correspondents, I have ex-research assistant, and I have journalists that I talk all the time to have data. Added to this is a lack of understanding of the dynamic dimension of data analysis and the risk for researchers and local research team. But the most serious issue for me is that even if the borders could be studied in a climate of instability, serious ethical consideration could arise. Participants in research projects remain vulnerable individuals who require strong ethical safeguard and protection. I had witnesses this in the case of Benin, that some of my research assistants called me and give me a lot of information. They say, Papa, I mean, yesterday they attacked the village that was close to my village. And I mean, I have to tell him, you have to go to Cotonou to seek for protection, those kind of things. I think also we need, as researchers, to protect our people who can give us such serious information. It is not only sufficient to protect personal data and obtain informed consent, but it is also necessary to implement systems to protect individuals who have participated in borders field studies. Strategic monitoring should be initiated downstream. You don't have to publish and then forget the people who are I mean, who you worked with, because after publication result also, you have to protect research assistants to ensure their lasting protection through the network relationships. You have seen the case of Afghanistan when Americans left. What they did, they brought all the people who were working with them, because if they left them in Afghanistan, they will be killed or will be tortured because they collaborated with the enemy. Those kind of things also. We have to be very conscious, we being researcher. Finally, to avoid causing further harms to participants and survey, we could do comparative analysis between unstable and stable borders. I think that area that can be a means of mitigation, for capable not only to identifying patterns and variation in border studies, but also of allowing highly vulnerable participants to be less exposed to risk. This is something very important. Sometimes researchers do not often collaborate with NGOs. I think somebody was saying that. But NGOs are the mines of information locally. You can have everything with them. So don't, on the ground and in borders areas, even though they remain mine of information, and local sources who often know the realities on the ground better than anyone. And I think this will be my last sentence. Collaborating with NGOs, but also with local authorities and community leaders could help to undertake alternative collection methods capable of moving us away from the potential risk of instability. This is, just as I said, a part of my chapter that I wanted to share and discuss with you, but obviously we can also talk on other aspects. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Papa.
Oh,
Natalia will be discussing your presentation or come with some comments when she is buckled up. And afterwards we will have a joint discussion.
You can leave the presentation if you like. It's not because we are talking about this, if you like. Thank you very much. Thank you, Papa, because such a like rich and detailed, complex chapter. But of course, I didn't have time to check it all. We'll have time, like until Uppsala, we have time. But I'll try to, because you are a geographer, I'm a sociologist, but I'm trying to think about space now to be closer to your level, okay? We'll do that, this exercise. So I'll just try to say 4 points of problematizations as quickly as possible, as I can do it. How can we can problematize border with space? Because as you're a geographer, space or place or territory, well, all this kind of terminology that you know very well. So first, like once geographically, space, it was clear that space was a concentration of tension, space as a contention of violence. That was very clear, no? And you give many examples: Morocco, Ethiopia, Congo, Senegal, Mozambique, etc. No, that was, I think, is the first part. Then you say that that you talk in general. Then another conception with the space and time. You say that in West Africa, at least, there's another conception of a space and time, how the people think about the space and time. So that's very important to understand, and that like makes different problematizations into practice and theory to understand all these changes. If you can explain a bit better this second point, why you say that in West Africa, humans would have a different conception of space and time, like shortly explain. Then third point with the territoriality. You talk about, there's also you talk like if there was like a different conception of cross-border spaces and territoriality in Africa, which is different here and which is common universally, if you can, quickly said, like or the main differences. And the last one would be another conception of a space, the idea of a itinerant territoriality, and if you think that happens, like this, you say something like this, for many Africans, which sometimes it's Africa, like, as a metaphor, it's difficult also. The border space is the place where a specific form of relationship takes place between the resident community and the foreigner, between the local and the global, between the traditional and the modern. So it's got everything there. So if you can resolve this, and this territorialization, the idea of reterritorialization, and then you talk also about sedentarization in the construction of cross-border cities. So if you can just give a bit of example of this. Only maybe about territoriality, I don't know if it was here in this acts of territoriality, I don't know in which one, but one that you say like a communities being separated, like Rosso, Senegal, that's a classic, So they say, the river, we were the same people, the Mauritanian and the Senegalese, whatever. and like the border, the colonial border, they cut the river, and you see what you've done. Is this only African? For example, one of the main, just to give you a counterexample, one of the main references on this, how the state has cut a community, and it's been studied very well, is the study of Sahlin with France and Spain, the Cerdagne, the French Cerdagne, how it's one of the biggest examples of this, or how a community, was cut cross with the French, like in the 18th century, something like that, just to think about sometimes what is African and it's universal, all these differences. I think it's very interesting. So that's all. I will not talk more because it would take. They are all, they are very, thick questions, but I think it's interesting to discuss. Thank you. I will sit down.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Natalia. I think, as I said, I'm not going to bother you with territories, places, and whatever here, but I think it is very clear that Africans have a way of producing space and a way of moving in the space, which is, I couldn't say that is totally different from that European do, but we have those kind of form of moving space that are very special to Africans. If you take like two concepts, migration and mobility. So African in the past, they were doing mobility because you have those communities that they were trans-border communities, the Fulani. Myself, I'm Fulani. And you have them in different countries, like you have them from Senegal to Benin to Cameroon, and then those kind of community, they have a special special aspect how they move to territory, because migration and borders was built, for me, was brought by the colonial powers, because they set up borders and they said, okay, if you have to migrate to Gambia, you have to cross a border, and then you have to have a passport or ID, whatever, those kind of things. Just this is an example of how to show that the special form of moving inside the space in Africa that are very different. Obviously, how Senegalese are moving, or Senegalese communities are moving, is very different how Kenyan communities are moving. how people from the from the Maasai are moving. Maybe it is related to a bit how Fulani are moving, because they are also people who have cattle, and then they have different overlapping practices. Yeah, but this is in this chapter also. This is something that I have to work, and I'm very happy that you said it, to differentiate what is universal and what is specific. I think I have to work on this for the people to understand better what I want to explain. For the borders and the example you give for Sardinia and for even Catalonia, because they divided Catalonia in two zones, which one zone is in France and the other one is in Spain. I think this is come for several wars that Europeans have between them. But I mean, our borders, first of all, they were divided when the colonial powers start setting up what they call this trading post. In French, they call them comptoirs commerciaux, where you set up a trading post and you said, this zone is my zone, and then if you have to enter in this zone, you need a kind of special permit or those kind of things. It's not, people tend to say the Conference of Berlin. No, it started before the Conference of Berlin. I think Mbembe explained it in one of his articles, that it is a process that goes beyond the Conference of Berlin, and it's not just maybe the Conference of Berlin was the most significant one that divided Africa in a map. Okay, so that people can say this is the contingency, this is the countries that we are living, and we have those borders. I mean, sometimes it is very difficult to, people could say, why you don't move your borders? Okay, you have Fulanis in Mauritania and you have Fulanis in Senegal, but in the current situation, I think the topic is not to moving the borders. The topic is how sovereignty can be developed in borders, and this is what is coming on in the Sahelian countries, in a country like mine in Senegal, where they try to reappropriate the resources. Like in Senegal, they are trying to renegotiate all the contracts with mineral companies that they had in the last government, and that was very bad contract. Like if you take the zircon mining, the government had 10% and the company has 80%. I think that is not fair, and then I feel this is the kind of sovereignism that people are trying to set up in West Africa, and it goes for contract, it goes for also to how to handle the resources and how to benefit from what you are selling to external companies. Well, this is what I wanted to respond on this. I don't know if there is other questions, maybe.
Thank you so very much. And as Natalia said, very rich. There's a lot in what you presented. This is more of a structural question, a sort of writing structural question, because to me, there were three kinds of dimensions where you were bringing challenges to the fore. One is definitely the epistemic, the conceptual, and the other is the pragmatic, the practical, the sort of clarity about that, and the other is methodological. And to some extent, I think these things were overlapping, and it wasn't clear and I think that the work is just to make it clearer. When are you talking about the conceptual challenges and the epistemic, and what are they? What is it that wasn't working conceptually, and what kind of epistemic erasures have there been, and what do you want? You kind of were saying that borders give us new ways, African borders give us new ways of thinking, but thinking about what? What's the epistemic in there, and the conceptual in there? There's a whole, it's kind of buried and overlapping. And then you had all these challenges about how borders are engaged with directly. What's happening at borders? What is it doing? What is it producing? What is it creating? What kinds of dynamics, etc. And then you raised in the last point these series of methodological queries and challenges and considerations. And I think it would be helpful, let's say, if you structured your writing in a way which actually posed them in quite distinct discussions and really went into, if you're saying this needs to be challenged, it wasn't entirely clear what's the this that needs to be challenged. It was clearer actually in the methodological, there are concerns and ethics and so on. In the pragmatics, there are, things to look at, but I kept on wanting to say, so what's the science of borders? Epistemically, conceptually, what's the science of borders? What is that science trying to unfold, see, show, explain? So I would really encourage that.
No, thank you very much. I think, you are right. Then maybe that is a very good criticism. I accept it. And I think I have encouragement. I have to see how I can reformulate my chapter on this. It is clear that the epistemic things were not very clear, but the methodological dimension challenges, as I try to. But what I refer to epistemics is the knowledges that we had before on the borders. Like, I don't know how they say it in English, the storytellings, récit de vie, in French, récit de vie, the memories, the myths. I think all these things are very important, and they are not taken into account. If you, I'm not a historian, but if you read about Greece, you can see that there is different myths of how they call borders, and different type of justification or delocalization of, knowledge coming from the borders. But I think this part for me in Africa is missing. Some people have started to do it, but I think they have to go in depth to see those kind of stories. Yes, those kind of stories, those kind of history tellings. The meaning of border can be different from different countries. I'm sure in Zimbabwe and or in Senegal you have a different meaning. What if you go to the tradition, what border means? Like a simple example in Senegal, we have an expression that we call nyak, and nyak is a closure, is something that is a barrier, and this barrier can be used in different levels, even in the society, in culture, in the special borders. I think those kind of stories maybe could revitalize the concept of border and then see the epistemics that I was saying. But I had in mind those kind of things, but as the presentation was very short and I didn't include it. Yeah, but I don't know if I responded to your question. Okay.
But actually, Amanda, I would like to welcome you on the stage as well as you, because we announced a joint discussion with our audience. If the audience feel like it, so we can please continue also commenting on Papa's presentation. And it doesn't have to be, whatever you think is of relevance to discussing African borders in motion could, I guess, qualify as debatable in this forum. Do we have a mic?
A mic for hand mic.
Der er en herre hernede.
Yeah, hello. Thanks. As an icebreaker, and because you said Amanda's coming up, can you hear me? Yeah. I said as an icebreaker, just to follow up already directly on what you presented before, Amanda. I wanted to ask more about... Yes, sorry. I'm Marcus Rudolph and senior researcher with Addis Ababa University. I wanted to ask you more about the challenges and the promises, because what you presented in your talk were referring a lot to this official agenda and the expectations that were raised, which I think is legitimate, and you as well showed how this politicians basically scare people off. But that's the top-down perspective. The bottom-up perspective, what I think now has been touched a little bit with the digitalization, to go from practical examples. You mentioned Ghana and then the Uganda one, but for example in Tanzania as well, what you have seen now everywhere, and when you said you started and then there has been a huge revolution. For example, in Ghana, it's the first time I've ever heard about is people now have a digital address, right? So now everybody everywhere usually has a physical address. And the first country I came across was in Africa, where again it makes a lot of sense if you don't even have street numbers, right? So you wouldn't have the possibility to send a letter. And it's a little bit like in the Sahel, where with mobile phones, you just skipped a step, because before the whole phone book of Mali was like 20 pages, and now everybody has a mobile phone. And this is important to mention, because in this last 20 years, what has happened is that from a few privileged people, and you talked about the elites and how they are interested to buy into this discourse about IDs. I think they had it before already, right? So that was necessary to travel, that was necessary to go and buy and and trade goods. And as well as the example you showed in Uganda touches a little bit upon problems that have been there before. So there was a very talkative and knowledgeable activist in Kenya from the Nubian community who, back from his grandfather's day, never managed to integrate. So this is kind of a repeating story. But what is new about it is that now, for example, when you look in Ghana or Tanzania, you're really excluded. So it doesn't matter all this stuff that you presented over there on the quote, which you might not access anyway. You talk about loans, this is middle class issues. But to not have access to a phone, and you mentioned as well refugees, and this is what in a lot of countries nowadays, that's the ultimate social exclusion. You cannot, and this is where you see it in Tanzania, they linked your identification and the need to have a birth certificate, which for decades they never managed to have, to the right to have a SIM card. And I think this is what, it's the same in Ghana with this physical and ID Ghana card. You really, you have M-Pesa in Kenya. So apart from all the state services, which might be interesting or not, and which for 90% of the people might not have been the reason to get the documentations, what has changed now is that from a few chosen ones to have a landline now, everybody needs access to a phone, and you need it for absolutely everything in your daily life. And in the last village, where there's no electricity, you will still have somebody who provides electricity to charge your phone. And this is, I think, now something that has been completely missing in this picture, and what is elementary, because you
missing in the research, but you mean
what in the larger picture, what you've presented is that, like with this exercise, for example, as in Tanzania or in Ghana as well, you really force people. You cannot pay, you cannot enter, you cannot transfer anything, and I think that's from the bottom-up perspective what is much more relevant, and what of course buys into this discourse, what you talked about from the top, but it complements each other and really is a qualitative change that I think needs to be really and clearly named.
Thank you for expanding on that. It wasn't a question, I guess so, but I just want to add is that it's in our research. Oh, am I not on? Sorry, I thought I'd switched it on. Is it not working? Turn me on. Yes? No? Can I use something else?
Yeah, but it was a comment for discussion, so not a question, yes.
No, I'm not taking it. Sorry, is it on? I'm not taking it as a question. I just want to say that we talk a lot about the SIM card. It's particularly, it's prevalent in right the way across. But the point is that as you're saying, people are forced to do this, to get that. The SIM card is fundamental, as are some other things as well. People are forced, and yet they still can't. So the question somebody asked me, in fact, in Leipzig, I was talking about some similar things. They said, but people don't get them, and yet what do they then do? And people still do stuff, and that's what I was kind of saying to you. So people borrow. They borrow SIM cards, they borrow names, they borrow families, give children to other families. They fake. Well, it used to be easier to do fake IDs before the digital era, before, this kind of biometrics, things that are turned, like embedded in the cards. But still, the forced to do and forced to get, and yet still people can't, and even if they can't, they find ways. That's kind of the living reality. And not everyone needs things in the same way to the same extent. So depending, you said like everyone needs it all the same. A little bit differentiated needs across. Some people say, I've never bothered with an ID. I don't even need it now, which is remarkable. Anyway, thanks.
One might perhaps even debate to whom an identity is fake, because who decides which kind of category makes the right identity? If you take this question further, and if you take it into the border areas where different groups of people live on both sides, who decide which identity is the right national one, right? Yeah, but do we have more questions?
Hello. My question was more related to Amanda's presentation, but like the other speakers as well can reply. So when I know that you said that you did not focus on like geographical borders, but I was wondering whether you can tell us a little bit more about how this digitalization of identity cards is also affecting both cross-border movement and, of course, the movement of people that might want to move outside of the African continent, because it's a lot of these reforms, as you were saying, are also very much related and financed by the European obsession to stop like some kind of mobility. And maybe Papa knows more about it. In Senegal as well, there have been financing coming from the European Trust Fund for Africa and others. So I was wondering whether you can tell us a little bit more about that. And also relatedly, you were showing us that a lot of these reforms are done through private companies, right? Technological companies, which I assume, I don't know because I'm not an expert in that, but I assume most of these companies are from the global north, I think. So I was wondering, if you know, maybe you don't know, we can also have a discussion about it, whether the data that they get to implement these reforms, where they will be stored, who will have access to this data, again, thinking about the problem of cross-border movement and also movement from Africa to Europe, as these data could be used in several different ways. And I'm thinking also, considering the moment in which we're living, about predicting policing, racial profiling, and all sort of different issues. Thank you.
Thanks. I am going to refer or defer to you on the borders, both of you, if on the international side, because I really can't speak to that. But I just want to say one thing about the sort of the close border, like say Ghana-Togo border, which is one of our PhDs has been studying. I mean, the only thing I'd like to really say about that is the intensification of policing of documents and of IDs and suspicion. I mean, there's a whole politics of suspicion and trust and so on. It's very intense at the borderlands. I mean, it's also true in Uganda. I'm sure it's true everywhere else. And it's especially crucial, not so much about accessing services or crossing the borders, because there's tons of informal ways that can happen. It's about voting. It's all about election times. So this, real voters' cards, ID cards, it used to be much easier for people to get voter cards. Now there's this Ghana card, and, there's much more questioning about and preventing, political prevention of, which party is in power will either encourage registration, ID registration, or discourage it, depending on those border areas and who's voting for whom. So that's the one thing that's really come up strongly on the borderlands. And maybe I'll come back afterwards to the data, but maybe you guys would like to talk about the international.
Do you want to start, Papa?
Sorry. Yeah, what I can say here is I think when you showed this quote from the Ugandan minister, I was thinking also about voting, calling people to vote, because this is very typical what they said. I mean, in my country, they like these motorcycles. They said if you don't have a helmet, you won't have some access to some information, and then they are campaigning for people to have helmet and then to drive. This is good for them because helmet is protecting, but I mean, people see it in there's and other subaltern discourses that they say that this is the state they want to have more money, and then there is a market on helmets, blah blah blah. I heard about this, but coming back to this issue of border securitizations, I think what they have now in West Africa, even in Senegal, is the companies are not only from the global north, they're also from global south, from India. India is the one setting up this, I forgot the name in Senegal, but now you don't have to go to the embassy. You have to go to this company to give all the papers, to pay, and then they will process the papers to the embassies to have a visa to come to Europe. And you can pay as much you can, but you will not be reimbursed. So this is also another debate of how Western embassies are getting money from migrants. This is what I want to say about your question. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. I mean, in the Ethiopian case, as in many African cases, I mean, you can see a line from the European Trust Fund starting to fund heavily in creating the technology and training of border officials to sort of police the external border as a one go. Then there is this digitalization of citizenship going on in parallel, funded by the World Bank. So you have the EU, you have the World Bank, and then you have the UN with UNHCR, ILO, and IOM being very active participants in this. In Ethiopia, the process is that you need to get a digital ID. It was established 2 years ago. The ID technology was owned by a government firm, Ethiopia Telecom, but has just gone over to Safaricom. So it started out being like also providing revenue actually for the state when you registered for the ID, but is now apparently privatized. But the whole discourse about it is that you register, you get an ID. You have to have an ID to have access to social services, but you also have, as a young person, to have an ID to get a job. Mm-hmm, exactly. And with this new system, you come into a labor database that the ILO has set up, right? And the ILO have sort of made one for local labor market and then one where you get into this international track.
Just explain what kind of labor databases they are, created out of what?
Yeah, because then there are all these trainings, vocational training centers. So you take training because you're out of a job, and you take training to become a plumber or a domestic worker or whatever, and you register. And some might only register for the national, but many would really like to register for the international. Then you are sort of in the loop. Then the ILO and other international UN organizations will say, well, protection labor rights is really important. So we also changed the curricula of the training. So you will be trained to be a plumber, or you will be trained to be a domestic worker. But in that training, we also train you in life skills, entrepreneurship, financial management, and savings. You sort of, so this whole process of generating employable people that can earn money, that can sort of stimulate the local economy, but also in a way self-protectable, because we teach you your rights. We teach you that this is the minimum wage. These are your rights, and yes, our embassy in Dubai or wherever will have a complaint system. The complaint system is also digitalized, right? So you can complain if your rights are not protected in this workspace. So there is sort of a belief that this system can work. But then there's the rumor economy among people that I'm just beginning to think about, where you say, like, you know, suspicion on part of the government that people are not who they say they are, but there are also a lot of suspicion about among people towards their government, which I also find interesting. I mean, this system was set up, and people, I mean, you know about the Tigray war, but there are also other regional conflicts going on in in Ethiopia, and it took like 2 split seconds before people began talking about this government program and registration will be only for Amharic or some other group, right? Whatever is in government. Oromo would be another one. So I'm not going that way, because they can then see where I am, where I go. So there's also a lot of reluctance on this, and it's probably not even true, but the rumor, the expectation is there, right? And it can be activated in this way. Some of the NGOs working with the shelter organizations had the same problem with their family reunification programs, right? Because the rumor came that now there's ethnic differentiation because of the idea, they are only sending back Oromos. They want to make Addis Ababa Amharic. So it goes, wow! And all of a sudden, it's a whole other ball game. So the good intentions of making people identifiable, giving them access to rights and social protections, and making them self-protectable, which is a term coined by Zhang Biao and Johan Lindqvist, actually, brings so much more with it in the process that we really need to take into consideration.
Absolutely. Actually, just in that, I wanted to read a last sentence, if I may, from I was quoting, did I take it out or leave it in? David Lyon, who's a big scholar on IDs. And I'm just going to read the last paragraph, the very last paragraph of the paper. So I said, in either case, despite the admirable ambition of legal identity for all and the grand promises accompanying the establishment of digital and biometric ID systems, in the absence of better understandings of complex lived realities, such systems are creating highly differentiated spaces and possibilities for social, political, and economic mobility. Then I say, this reinforces David Lyon's somewhat conspiratorial suggestion that the newly evolving ID systems with their searchable digital databases allow states to profile different populations so that they may be treated differently, which I think sort of relates to what you just said. I do want to just come back, if I may. I mean, I liked a lot of the things you said about suspicion and so on, but I just want to come back to your data question and companies. You're right, there are some sort of African companies. I mean, the government is not a company, but they would have maybe allied with, I don't know what the Ethiopian case is or how they constructed the notion of, this is their system. Whoever, but I mean, it would
nationalized firms.
Nationalized firms. I mean, the thing is that there are a lot of these increasingly well-known, but sometimes blacklisted, you could say, forgive the expression, companies that have made countries dependent on these systems. I mean, it's so vulnerable. This is about sovereignty. This is about data of population data systems, etc. And it's not just a product like any other. It's very sensitive and so on. And there have been cases, and I can't actually remember them specifically to quote exactly, but where companies have withheld because of failure to pay. Failure to pay for the services, so freezing the sort of possibility of making use of the data, but also, so that's one side of it. Data is very vulnerable in those kinds of systems. But there are, obviously questions about what levels of data mining is going on. What kind of data extraction is there? And that's a whole area that I think some people are exploring. It's not really what we were talking about. But the other side, and the irony or the paradox, is that you have this extremely sophisticated technology, you have extremely sophisticated companies, you have investments, you have experts and so on, and then you have countries where electricity doesn't work, where staff are not adequately trained, where you have like in Uganda, you have the national identification number. So that should be sufficient. It's this 14-digit number. It's got a C if you're a citizen and an A if you're something else. But there is these numbers, and that, like in Denmark, you can give your CPR number. So in principle, you should be able to go to a bureaucrat and register, or a public service and give your number. But actually there's a bit of rent seeking going on, or kind of sideways work, so that local bureaucrats insist that you show your card. And then, because also with the number, if the machinery is not working, they can't even check that you are who you are. So this kind of economy around the card itself, and in the absence of the card, what are you paying? How are you paying? How are you circumventing? Those kinds of rent-seeking practices are going on as well.
And comment something.
Okay.
Just, I just wanted to comment something on what you say, but I don't know in the case of Africa, but I know in the case of the European context, that has been, worked a lot. I don't know if you know this kind of bibliography, for example, Patrick Simon in the case of France, but they are very, they've been working on this for years, like saying, if identification is like the source of discrimination or not. There's a huge debate. The French have been working on this for 20 years. I think even if it's another context, but it's nice, very productive to have a look at it, which is contrary to the British system of racialization and all that. I don't know if you know, in the UK, now you go to a place, I have to identify myself as a white other, so I'm called white other in the UK. Those things that can be shocking also for us, who how they see each other, or like in the US you're a Latino, in England I'm a white other. It changes, where you are, the context. It's more just to have more reference on that. And I'm giving an example about Europe, but now I want to go against this example, this context of Europe. Because I don't know what Papa thinks, but about the book, because for me, like the book talking about Agnese was a bit is African borders in motion, but is thinking in motion. I don't know. I'm just talking about myself, but me, I'm tired of all the thing about Europe. Externalization of Europe. You just check how many articles there are in the 2 last years on externalization of European borders. Everything is to do about Europe, and that's why when I started reading that about the Chinese and everything in Africa, it's like, come on, let's think about other ways about thinking about African borders. It's not always, what is Europe doing? We know many things, but we cannot just produce to me, as I don't know how Papa sees it, always, repeating the same story, like thousands of millions, the Mediterranean. Me, I work on the Mediterranean, and I'm a scholar on the Mediterranean, but it's enough of works on migration in the Mediterranean. How many, videos, films on the Mediterranean, and, we have thousands of videos, thousands of films, millions of articles. I think we need to, to try to see things differently, and that's why even if it's complicated and it takes, and we can be new in many things, but let's see the African borders from Africa, a little bit. That was a bit, that is complex, but I think there's an effort there to do something different, at least, no?
Yeah, totally right. Can I talk?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
definitely.
No, you're totally right. But I think if you take the example of the book, we have, half of the authors are Africans, so that is a good brand, at least, and they are talking what they are living in Africa, in their frontiers, in Cameroon, in Senegal, in other countries, no? Not talking about Europe at all, no? But if they go referencing to Europe, is about the colonization, and then this aspect, you cannot miss it. Somehow in your paper, you have to go back to this, even if it's minimizing. But yes, I'm very agree with this. And another thing that I wanted to point out is I mean, how this world organization, financing organizations are looking money in in papers. I just give you a small example. I live in a very remote village in the suburb of Dakar. And once I wake up, and then I was in Uppsala, they sent me a mail. I said, there is a team of World Bank coming to the village and then fencing the houses. I said, wow, this is
the houses?
to census.
Census.
Yeah, census, yeah. And then they said,
the bank is doing the census.
yeah, and I said, this is great. And then I was very happy. I said, yeah, then they will do a plan of urbanism plan for your house. I said, yeah, you do for my house. And then after 2 months, the teams come and they send the result. They said, okay, now every house has to pay this amount.
Yeah.
I said, this is crazy. And then you see, though, this is, I mean, obviously, World Bank is working for money, but also the government. And then this is a new, they are looking for assets, I mean, to localize people. And then the more you have land, the more you will pay. So this is a simple example of how this identification is going on in all Africa. Even when you said Togo, we had this digitalized ID card long ago before Togo. Senegal and I think Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire were the first country who had this digital even passport, and then how they call it ID. So, and then the companies. Like the company who made this ID of Senegal, it was Ivorian company.
It was what?
Ivorian country from Ivorian, yeah. So that means the south also is working. Eh? It's not only the global north to the global south. Yeah, it's very It's a complicity. Exactly. Yeah, this is what I wanted to say. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just say, I mean, at one level, I think you are right, Natalia, in terms of which voices do we want to hear about, and why shouldn't we focus also on what is happening in terms of African happenings on African borders. My problem with that is, however, that we have been talking about colonization and decolonization and what's going on with the European Trust Fund and these new investments in border management is in many ways a new colonization, because it influences the minds of local rulers. It changes how borders and populations are talked about in national politics in Africa. So we cannot ignore, I would say, these attempts of recolonization through other means that are very, very powerful. So ideally, I mean, a global approach where you look at, of course, what's going on locally, what's going on regionally. I mean, in terms of migration, the regional is much more important, actually. That's where the big movements are. And then globally. So have a dialogue between these different scales of influences on how borders materializes in the daily lives of people who live in those territories, right?
Can I add something?
Just very short, but at the global level, we had I don't know if you remember, a chapter that it failed, it collapsed, Juan David Sampere. You wouldn't imagine the maps that we had on, like the transportation of, from, you wouldn't believe it, that Brazil and Europe had nothing to do with Brazil, with Latin America, between Latin America and Africa, within all this information that people know little about it, no? And we were trying to produce that on a chapter, but anyway, it's too long to explain.
I'd like to come in there a little bit, because I think it's a fabulous project, this African Borders in Russia. But I do want to challenge you a little bit, Natalia, because you're speaking as if there is no knowledge, there has been no knowledge about these dimensions, these dynamics, these everyday lives on the continent, and that it has to be like stimulated. And one thing about African studies and critical African studies that I'm really so sort of invested in, is the idea which we promote and we work with, is Africa on its own terms. Africa is living on its own terms and has been living on its own terms, not forgetting historically colonialism and new colonialism and sort of coloniality and so on. But it's the thing about African studies is it keeps saying to people, you're assuming that this isn't known, or is that nobody's been studying it, or, you know, it's also about what kinds of knowledge is actually visible, not whether or not certain knowledges exist at all. Sure, we're all in the business of producing knowledge and investigating and digging in and learning from each other, but there is an immense amount that's already known. There are African researchers who've been doing things which may not be in the, you know, the big publications and so on. And so it's just a more of an ethical sort of question about how one projects the ideas that, you know, we should, like, as if things haven't been done, now we're going to do it. We're going to bring Africans in. The fact that you have half of the book with African scholars is necessary. It's just an obvious thing. But it's really to say that this is not an absence in itself. It's just a lack of knowing what is already there. And in that sense, the word epistemic erasure is part of the story. It's not that knowledges aren't there or experiences aren't there, and plenty more to be said and new things to be said in new ways, absolutely. But it's also necessary to remember that those knowledges have been there and people have been talking about them and maybe writing stories about them for a long time.
So the problem is visibilization.
Recognition first of what's there, and yes, recognizing too that the sort of knowledge economy is incredibly lopsided, you know, incredibly distorted, and that we surely know, and that's part of, you know, the decolonial moment now. I just needed to say a little bit about that.
I have checked my email. I have no questions from the outside, but maybe we have more comments or questions from the audience. Yes, we do.
Hi, my name is Alba, and I'm a PhD student at Malmö University. And I was wondering, I'm at the early stages of my PhD, and I'm still playing with concepts and theories and all of this. And I was really wondering, was a question to Amanda, like, because you mentioned it, but you skipped over it, the difference between classification, or how you understand the differences between classification and categorization, and how you use it in the research. And I also had another question that was a bit related to this epistemic erasure, because I'm doing research in the border between Morocco and Spain, and the difference on perceptions of what the border is and what it means for people and how people understand it. But of course, looking into Moroccan society and at the same time looking at the Spanish society. So it's total different ways of perceiving a border. So my question was basically more to Papa, I think, but how do we bring this new epistemology or this like science of borders to the research? How do we apply it? How do we produce knowledge out of that? Like, what can we get out of these new epistemologies? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Who will start?
I mean, the epistemic question is always difficult to respond because, as I said, I think Amanda said it very well. The stories are always there. I mean, I have heard several stories about borders, even being researching in Benin, but of course I don't see them in books. I don't see them. I think this is what Natalia is saying, visibilizing, make them visible. This is maybe the challenge we have on this chapter of the book. And obviously, stories from Spain are totally different from what they have in Morocco. This is obvious. I think we have to dig into those aspects. As I said, the memories, the stories, the local knowledge that people have on borders. I think those are aspects that are very important to show the epistemic challenges that we have on, particularly on my chapter. Yes, I think I have, because I have done several longitudinal studies in those border areas, and I have several small stories that I have heard. I even have, how they call it, records, audio record and all this. And then I think it is also time to exploit all these materials that they have, and then to see how I can make it in practice in the book. Yes, but thank you very much. Yeah.
Can I just add on to that more on this question of what do you do in a Morocco-Spain border? So there are distinct ways of understanding, experiencing, mythologizing, conceptualizing, feeling about what the border means. Now, I want to just go back to this work that I did with Marianne Milstein on juxtacities or juxtaposition. And the thing that really came out of our looking at differences wasn't looking at the divides as separation. It was looking at the frictions, the articulations, the engagements between differences that are side by side. And this is like a perfect sort of borders, of course, literal borders, physical borders are perfect sort of for that idea of juxtaposition and looking at friction and articulation and what does that produce. Not what does it simply divide or what does it simply separate, but what does the interface and the that happens there, both conceptually, infrastructurally, physically with movements going across. It's a beautiful opportunity for not an either-orness, but a interconnectedness conceptually as well as empirically and then analytically. I think that's the thing about it. On the classification and categorization, I think for me, just to, as I said, acts of classification, I just want to repeat this, is constructing typologies of difference. So do you construct typologies through class, socioeconomic kind of differences, through gender differences, through ethnicized, through racialized? So there's the noting difference and then classifying, saying there is this difference, this is what it looks like, this is what this is and this is and this is. Categorizing is saying what does that difference mean to whom, and that shift, that categorization and the value placed on different differences is another practice. And it's the most, they both have a politics to them. The politics of naming something is the politics of, classification. The politics of categorization is a politics of difference and power and all the implications that has for all the differences.
Which migrants can claim asylum?
Yes.
For instance,
Yes.
right?
Why Ukrainians can come to Denmark and Syrians less easily, or Nigerians definitely less easily. Yeah.
There was a hand there behind. Oh, yeah. Oh.
Yeah, thanks. I was just thinking about to withdraw the comment because it might go too far. But as we speak of epistemics, I think as well being part of this book, I wanted to point out that there's a risk. When I heard first about epistemics, we all sit here. I think nobody's from England. We all speak English. We are not in England. We speak English. Nevertheless, we deal with English concepts, and epistemology is one of them. And when I first heard it coming from Germany, they said like this is theory of how you recognize things. That's how it was translated in Germany, Erkenntnistheorie. And we usually don't use it. We have a wider one where you not only talk about how you will recognize certain things. And what I think is a risk in this is that we talk about, as you said, like having different epistemologies, but what I see, and as well being an artist, and what I see in general now, what is streamlining the research, what we said, having all on the same issue. This is all connected to a wider stage academics are in, and we are in a neoliberal age where you have to sell stuff, and if you want to sell it, it has to be in a certain language, it has to use certain words, it has to be in a certain trend, and just by integrating now, and this for me is another way of colonializing, because we speak so much about decolonialization, but this is maybe a discourse that you impose on people, right? my colleagues in Ethiopia will tell you we have not been colonized. You can argue about this Italian or whatever, but of course, in a way, they're right. They say we have to speak about an issue which is an issue of your perspective. Eurocentrism is a European perspective. You deal with it. Leave us alone with it. But you have to, be in a global discourse that is an Anglo-Saxon discourse, that is a certain material discourse all behind it. And what we should be aware of is that's the risk of just saying, well, we integrate all those different colors and origins might not be necessarily helpful unless you tell them, well, it's not only your voice, but as well as a voice in the way you usually, as you said, you specify yourself, you express yourself, It might be storytelling, it might be saying, well, we have to have a dialogue on which kind of rationality we'll accept in a book, but it's a risk and nobody speaks about it. You just say, well, we integrate more, and this is, well, I see you shaking your head, but that's as well what I see with in DIIS. Of course, some do, but no, I'm not saying that this is not happening, but I say the majority is a trend which we as well have to be aware of. The World Bank and all the financing we talked about, it's as well happening in academics. They as well own and shape and pay for this discourse. And we should talk more about it. Maybe this is a way.
In the light of that, and with great respect for Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who's passed away, that reminds me of the debate and the disagreements between his view, which was to decolonize language and to write in his own language, etc., and Chinua Achebe, who said, if I want not just the person, my mother, to understand what I'm talking about, in my local village, in my local dialect, but I want to engage, for example, with the whole of Nigeria, which had multiple languages, and the lingua franca would be English. So there are two sides to that very same story, which is which languages, for which kinds of engagements, making space for whom, and always, in my view, seeing those whatever options as dynamic.
Yeah, but I think there's more to your comment, right? Because you are saying that the epistemological thinking is also bound to language. So, we cannot, we need a lingua franca. It doesn't need to be English. I can do it in Spanish or in French or in German, but I can't do it in all languages, right? But I think an awareness of how certain ways of thinking are bound to certain languages, and maybe that a German expression for something, I totally get what you're saying, open my mind in another way to a certain question than, say, the English. I think better in Spanish, for instance, obviously. I think it's a richer language than the English one, so I get your point, and I think it's beyond the need of a lingua franca. I think we agree on that.
Oh, I think, you want to say something?
Well, just say two quick things. And about the language, I'm just thinking always about the book. I answer like if it was the book because of course we thought a lot about the languages, and we use a lot French. Normally, it's the first time we only use English. Normally, we use French, and we have our problems also using sometimes only French as a lingua franca. But in Uppsala, Mayeiros is going to do a presentation on the three divisions of what it means, the Lusophone, the Francophone, and let's see, and Anglophone. So it's an issue for us, and it will be there. And just talking about ALBA, because I think that's called, normally we call them border ethnographies. So there is a lot of bibliography on border ethnographies between Spain and Morocco. And for me, the star on these border ethnographies, if you like, is a Bila with the case of El Paso. I don't know, he's got 3 volumes of border ethnographies. You have all the details there.
No, what I want to say is I would be very happy if the book was in Fula or Fulani, because So I won't borrow English language or a lingua franca, but this is what we have in the table. And then the publisher is from Britain, so American, whatever. So maybe we also have to have the American style of doing
We're thinking already. I told you about the podcast, and the podcast will use other languages.
Exactly. Yeah, I think this is. But you pointed a very good, nice point. I like this, and I think also personally I have to think about this and to see specify the understanding in the lingua franca, which is important because.
Havde vi været i Spanien, så ville jeg nu ikke bare have sagt tusind tak for i dag på dansk, så ville jeg have sagt det på dialekt. Så ville jeg have sagt, det var dejligt at se jer. Vi har været glade for at komme. Men det gør jeg selvfølgelig ikke. I'm just saying that had this been in Spain, I would either have opened or ended in Danish, and I would not only have used the overall Danish, but my special dialect. So, I mean, time is up, and we have to start at 2 sharp with the next part of the program. But as we announced, there is a sandwich. So please grab one if you're not continuing in the afternoon. And Natalia has a very short.
You know what the people that will be like online just to know.
No, exactly.
In the afternoon, so they want to follow us.
Yes, hello. Yeah, just wanted to say that we will, as she was saying, we will start at 2 and we will have 3 different panels. Most online Marcus, right, will be here with us, and we will be talking about, again, borders in many different contexts, among which Casamance in Senegal, Cameroon, and several, and Morocco as well, from different speakers. So, and
Morocco, no, the desert, I'll tell you. There's one on the desert, like a very important one with the Algerian desert. There's one on the Algerian desert. The one on Yambene maybe will fail. Marcus on the Casamance. What else? Mario on the Roman legacy of the African borders. And that's all, no? Which one is? Okay.
if not, we will find out.
Thank. No, just so people know if they want to follow. And the one on Tunisia, women in Tunisia, which is very important also. Women in Tunisia and Sicily. Thank you. African women.
Thank you for inviting us.